Folks, if you're new or joining us for the first time, this is the Apologetics Academy, which I run every Saturday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, 2 p.m. Central, 12 noon Pacific, which here in the UK is 8 p.m. And every week we bring on different scholars, apologists, experts from across the theological and philosophical spectrum to present to us on topics of interest to Christians, particularly pertaining to whether the question of whether Christianity is true. And we also bring on representatives of other worldviews to present the case for their respective worldviews, and so on. And this evening we're having a talk and Q&A session with a Muslim apologist from South Africa called Yusuf Ismail. And we'll talk more about that in just a second. The following week, next week, we have Dr. Michael Bird coming on from Australia. He's a well-known biblical scholar, and he is going to be talking to us about his book, How God Became Jesus, which was co-authored with Craig Evans and some others as well, which is a response to Bart Ehrman's book, How Jesus Became God. That one will be at 3 hours later than normal because he's in Australia, so we're accommodating his time zone. And then the following week on December 10th, we have Oxford University philosophy student Josh Parikh talking to us about the problem of evil from a Christian perspective. And then the last session of the year will be on December 17th with Dr. Frank Turek, who wrote a book called Stealing from God, Why Atheists Need God to Make Their Case. And he is going to be talking to us about that book. So if you are joining us as a viewer this evening, there's a number of different ways you can participate. You can sit and listen anonymously if you so choose. You can also participate in the chat window. You can also submit questions anonymously by typing them in to there's a Q&A button at the top of your screen. If you click that and type in your question, then I will read it to our guest speaker. Or if you want, you can also raise your hand, and when it comes to the Q&A, I will promote you to be a co-panelist with our speaker, and you'll have an opportunity to engage in dialogue and interact. So, as I said, this evening we are blessed to have with us Yusuf Ismail from South Africa, who's going to be talking to us about the Qur'an, whether it promotes peace or aggressive violence. So do you want to take it away, Yusuf?
That's fine. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I begin in the name of God, most gracious, most merciful. I want to thank you, Jonathan, again for these programs. I just saw the comment by Robert Price on your Facebook page a few minutes ago, where he complimented you on giving opportunities to different people. And I think it's important that we deal with these kind of discussions and subjects and, of course, engage each other respectfully and, of course, with a degree of basically mutual understanding between each other's and different groups and faith and communities. So how do we deal with this particular issue? Is the Quran a book of peace or violence, or does the Quran in fact promote peace or violence? Well, let's look at I just want to move to the my next slide. Okay, there's an individual called Edward Bernays. There's a significance behind why I'm putting him up. This is a quotation made by him, I believe it's in the early part of the 20th century. He stated that if we understand the mechanism and motives of the group mind, it is now possible to control and regiment the masses according to our will without them knowing it. If you look at the background behind this individual, this is someone who is viewed as the father of modern day propaganda. In fact, many companies use them as a means to program the public into believing certain things. Here's classic examples about cigarette smoking. This is one particular classic example. Lucky Strike cigarettes being sold in the, I think, early 1920s, and to give the indication that it was something which is healthy, something which is beneficial. Here's another example: more doctors smoke Camel than any other cigarette. Now, what's the significance of me bringing this up? The point is that it's very possible in today's time, due to a mass disinformation campaign, for people to in fact believe in and in fact follow all forms of propagandist discourse that one basically can come across. And if you can create a mass consensus amongst individuals into believing certain elements and certain aspects according to your own will, then it becomes far more easier to basically brainwash populations in terms of how they view other people. And so it's important that when we analyze communities, when we analyze societies, when we analyze individuals, when we analyze religion, that we go to the root source of the material. And so therefore it comes back to the topic, what's the root source for a Christian? If you look at the doctrine of sola scriptura, it would be the Bible. And of course, for a Muslim, it would obviously be the Quran. So you take this further. If you look at the top section of the screen, no one thinks that any of those people are representative of Christianity, the Ku Klux Klan. So why do many people think that those in the bottom, characterized by ISIS, are in fact representative of the teachings of the Quran, as an example? One could go on further. That's an Islamic organization, the individual with the acronym ISIS, in as much as that is a Christian organization. So it's important that we move beyond the kind of conventional stereotypes, conventional propaganda, and the negativity that we see out there. I also want to point out that I would assume a large number of people probably listening to this would be, primarily Christians. And I've somehow the other come across, more often than not, a critique against the Quran and sometimes against Islam, which is more akin to the type of critique that one would get from atheists. I think it's not behoving, both for Muslims and Christians, to engage in the type of gutter level discourse whereby we simply utilize each other's faiths as a means of a polemical exercise whereby we want to simply evangelize and convert the other side. And in doing so, really engage in low-level type of argumentation in terms of how we address each other. And I would appeal to my Christian brothers out there that why would you want to promote an idea about Islam which basically, in fact, sustains the mantle of the extremists? It's quite remarkable that if you look at the ideas and the beliefs of Robert Spencer, as one classic example, his ideas about Islam are not very much different from those of Osama bin Laden, but both, interestingly enough, have similar views about Islam. And so it begs the question, I need to obviously question your motives and question the agenda behind these kind of ideas. So why the double standard? Why the willingness to believe the hype and rhetoric from the spin doctors and propagandists? And as one noted apologist says, let us maintain even scales. Inconsistency is a sign of a failed argument. If you're not inconsistent pertaining to your worldview, why choose another standard when looking at somebody else's worldview? So here's someone called Philip Jenkins, and he comes from a Christian background. But in addressing the issue of violence in the Quran, in an article that he basically wrote a few years back, this is what he basically says: that if Christians or Jews needed biblical texts to justify deeds of mass slaughter or terrorism, the main problem would be the embarrassment of riches. Now, we're not obviously going to talk about the Bible today, maybe some other time. Is someone looking for the next best text to justify suicide terrorism? Well, you can look at the example of Samson. The Quran offers nothing explicit besides general exhortations to a war. Some passages in the Bible, in contrast, seem expressly designed for that purpose. Now, the point is not to pick holes or unnecessarily attack or bash Christianity or bash the Bible. But what I'm saying is that if people want to, put forth this idea that violence is intrinsic in the Quran, or the Quran fundamentally and primarily promotes violence, then by the same standards, how would you, for example, hold to account passages like Numbers 31, verse 17? You'd obviously appeal to a context there. So why would the same standard not obviously be used when dealing with passages in the Quran? So when looking at the Quran, then we can look at it in different ways. The one way is the way in which academics, in fact, approach the Quran. They would obviously take a naturalistic worldview. Muslims and Christians, on the other hand, tend to take a supernaturalistic worldview when analyzing the Quran and the Bible. In fact, obviously Christians would take a supernaturalistic worldview when analyzing the Old and the New Testament. And my suggestion is that perhaps is there maybe a middle way to perhaps approach these texts, whereby we can approach them with a far more balanced, meaningful approach, as opposed to these two particular polarized approaches when looking at religious scripture. And I'm going to attempt to do that, and let's see how far and where it can take us. So what methodology should we start off with? Well, this is generally the methodology that people fail to adopt when analyzing any religious book. And I would afford the same principle to the Holy Bible. that when you look at a text in the Bible, we look at the entire text, and we also look at the text that goes with it, the context. And so you have to look at the intertextual and the contextual interpretation of passages in both scriptures, both the Bible and, in fact, both the Quran. My suggestion tonight, and the thrust of my discourse would be, is that if you look at the intertextual and the contextual interpretation of passages in the Quran, you will see that at a primary level, it would, in fact, promote universal peace. Now, are there passages that obviously deal with violence in the Quran? Of course there are, and I'm not going to shy away from that. But the important key point, and that's why it's critical to this topic, does the Quran promote aggressive violence? Violence sometimes becomes necessary. War sometimes becomes necessary. And, we'll obviously look at the issue of the just war principle. But the point is that if you look at it in juxtaposed verses of the Quran and look at it in its entirety, you would see that the message primarily would be to, in fact, promote universal peace. Another fourth point that one can see is that we also need to distinguish the Quran itself and, of course, secondary source material and what people may say later. Now, you can obviously look at the hadith corpus material. You can look at the juristic interpretations that developed much later. One quick point I need to, add on that particular issue is that when Muslim jurisprudence was at its systematic juristic form during the Abbasid period, what it did was that it also incorporated the logic of Muslim imperialism at that particular point in time. So, for example, when you had undeniably certain Muslim states and the Muslim empire in its expansionist form, jurists would obviously attempt to justify this expansionism by, in certain instances, in some cases, appealing to the Quran, and where there was lack of material in the Quran, mythologize and invent material about the life of the Prophet Muhammad, which would obviously give them legitimacy and justification for whatever act of aggression that they may have engaged in. So it's important to understand that historical background when we look at this particular point. Now, here are 5 standards that one can also look at when analyzing the Quran. You find in the Quran biblical heroes, or biblical prophets for that particular matter, people like Moses, people like David, Solomon. How do these particular heroes fare in the Quran? Are they fundamentally peaceful, or are they primarily violent? Take a character like Moses. How does Moses fare in the Quran? Is he a violent individual, or is he someone that is peaceful? How does Moses appear in the Old Testament? Is he violent, or is he peaceful? Look at David. How does David appear in the Quran? There's one act of violence that is basically leveled against David in the Quran, and that's the act of killing Jalut or Goliath. But besides that, there's no other act of violence. In fact, even the narrative of the slaying of Goliath, it just ends there. It doesn't speak about him going and beheading him or anything like that, which you may find, for example, in the Old Testament. So how do these heroes fare in the Quran? Are they peaceful or violent? Number 2, does the Quran in fact command people to live in peace? I think that's a key point. Does it have a legal system whereby people can in fact engage in covenants of security with each other? Is there a legal system to allow people to live in peace? Do you have a legal system, for example, in the New Testament, which allows people to live in peace? And of course, the fourth point, more importantly, how do you conduct yourself in times of war? Do we have a certain standard, a certain guideline in terms of how we conduct ourselves when war, in fact, becomes inevitable? Are there certain rules? Can you, for example, kill men, women, and children, oxen, suckling, donkeys? Can you do all of that? Can you, in fact, engage in sanguinary warfare to the extent that we see a mass extermination of an entire generational race? Is that basically allowed, or are there certain standards and criteria that we have to follow? So we'll basically look at that. Now, I will also point out that let's start off with the idea of peace, or salam, or istislam, for example, or even the term Islam. I would argue that peace, in fact, permeates the fabric of Islam. As-salam, for example, would be a divine name of Allah, the peaceful one. Paradise in the Quran, and I'm just giving you a brief summary, is described as an abode of peace. When Muslims are to greet each other, and also people of other faiths, they are to say, peace be with you, assalamu alaikum, the universal greeting throughout the world. In fact, the Quran says, وَإِذَا حُيِّيتُمْ بِتَحِيَّةٍ فَحَيُّوا بِأَحْسَنَ مِنْهَا, that if someone gives you a greeting, then give him something even better than just simply mere greeting him. In other words, you wish people well. And of course, the common root word of Islam, one of the root words at least, it could mean surrender, it could mean to submit, but a more accurate definition, taking into account all the root meanings of this particular word, would mean peace acquired through submission to the will of God. So one can argue from that perspective that peace to a certain extent permeates the fabric of Islam. What about the idea of inclining towards peace? Is there an inference in which people should incline towards violence or towards peace? Well, look at Surah 8, verse 61. And again, this is a Medina surah. It's a Medina surah, and I'm going to explain the significance behind that later on as I go through this presentation. It says, if they incline to peace, وَإِن جَنَحُوا لِلسِّلْمِ, and note the word is lisilm, silm, which will appear again. If they incline to peace, you should also incline to it and put your trust in Allah. Now, who is they? Who is they? It's obviously those who are not Muslims, those of other faiths, particularly polytheists. Verily, He is the all-hearer, the all-knower. Surah 4, verse 90. So if they withdraw from you and fight not against you and offer you peace, then God has opened no way for you against them. Now, who is it referring to here? Refers to the hypocrites, and again also to the polytheists, and also those who, for example, apostatize. Quite strangely enough, that in a debate that I did in 2012 with Jay Smith, he somehow or the other used the verse prior to this, Surah 4 verse 89, as giving an indication that this now refers to a death penalty being applied for apostasy. And what he did was he engaged in the cherry-picking fallacy, where he simply quoted this particular verse in isolation, and of course when you read the entire verse, it defeats the argument that he wanted to basically present. So again, these are Medina surahs, just bear that in mind. In the very beginning of every chapter of the Quran, except one, that is in Surah Tawbah, you find Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in the name of Allah, God, the most gracious, the most merciful. So Allah, in fact, is not only the gracious and the merciful, but also wants humanity to be gracious and merciful to each other. And how do you note this? There is a noted saying attributed to the Prophet where he says, imbue thyself with divine attributes. And one of the divine attributes of God is graciousness and mercy, and of course peace. And so if you imbue thyself with the divine attributes, if you internalize that, then obviously this can be inferred from the fact that many verses in the Quran point in this particular direction, and you yourself as an individual should have the same kind of characteristics and qualities. So I hope that this basically shows the pattern and the line in which I am basically heading. One of the attributes of Allah, again, merciful, Arabic word Rahim, that appears about 227 times. 114 mentions of Bismillah, in the name of God, most gracious, most merciful, is obviously in the Quran. So peace, I would argue, is a cornerstone of Islam. In Islam, in fact, God calls all people to live by the moral values He sets. So compassion, mercy, peace, love can be experienced all over the world. And interestingly enough, in Surah 2, verse 208, you have this interesting verse which says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, and it says, Udkhulu fi silmi kafa. Now, note in the previous slide that I basically showed you, if you look at Surah 8, verse 61, وَإِن جَنَحُوا لِلسِّلْمِ, can you see, if they incline to peace? And in Surah 2, verse 208, the passage is, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, oh, you believe, enter absolutely into peace completely. That would be the more accurate translation. Now, some people have translated this as enter into Islam completely, but there's absolutely nothing in this particular passage which in fact allows one for that particular translation or interpretation. In fact, if you look at the works of a noted grammarian, Jonathan, his name is Az-Zajjaj, he points out that every time the word silm appears in the Quran, it is translated as peace or inclining to peace. And the one time where this word appears, Surah 2, verse 208, some of the commentators or the early classical mufassirin found it problematic as to how the Quran basically would call someone to enter absolutely into peace. You know, bearing in mind that they were writing in a time of an expansionist milieu where violence, where warfare was probably being conducted. And so they basically inserted the word Islam. But for that to read, you would basically, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, udkhulu fil Islam. And in actual fact, it's udkhulu fi silmi kafa, not udkhulu fil Islam kafa. It doesn't basically pronounce that. And so many scholars today are now pointing out that that in fact is a more accurate translation. It goes on to say, do not follow in the footsteps of Satan. He's an outright enemy to you. Again, I hear this all the time by many people from the evangelical community, that Islam is satanic. This is Satan speaking. Well, here it is a verse which says, do not follow the footsteps of Satan. So if Satan basically authored the Quran or inspired the Quran or was the kind of the chief architect, then would he basically instruct people not to follow him? Or would he, for example, instruct people that when you read his book, you are to say, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, I seek protection in God from Satan, the accursed? Would Satan say, when you read my book, ask God to protect you from me? Can you see? So when you look at the Quran in its entirety, you find that in itself, it defeats the kind of false propaganda, lies, and stereotypes that you see all the time. And so in this particular verse, you would see that Islam intrinsically calls for peace. It fosters a life in absolute sincerity and honesty before God. And I would argue that it's the only religious book, not saying that the Bible doesn't contain passages on the peace and so on, and other faiths as well, but it's the only religious book on the face of the earth which has a passage like this: enter absolutely into peace completely. Udkhulu fi silmi kafa, Surah 2, verse 208. What are some of the myths that one can tackle? Well, one of the issues is that some people have this idea, which I see people are moving away from, that somehow or the other, people can be compelled to accept Islam or forced to accept Islam. Now think about it, that if people were in fact forced by the sword or forced under duress to accept Islam, then effectively the early generation of Muslims would be a bunch of hypocrites. And how do you sustain hypocrisy? If I were to come to your house, Jonathan, and hold a sword or hold a gun to you, or to anyone for that particular matter, and say, proclaim now on Skype or on Zoom, I accept Islam, and out of fear you say, I accept Islam, it doesn't mean you accept Islam. And so the point is that, again, this is a self-defeating argument. From a logistical and strategic point of view, it just simply doesn't make sense. So no one can be compelled to live by Islamic morals. The Islamic point of view is that it's only God who guides people to the right way. And one classic verse we could also deal with, it's a Medina verse, by the way. It's not a Meccan verse. It comes from Medina, Surah 2, verse 256. Like Rahafiddin, let there be no compulsion in religion, for truth stands out distinct from falsehood. In other words, whatever way you want to choose, you can choose to do that. Now, there is some thought or some idea or some warped concept that this verse is no longer applicable. Okay? So it's not applicable. Then what do we do then about Surah 22, verse 67? In Surah 22, verse 67, also a Medina surah, لكل أمة جعلنا منسكنهم ناسكوه فلا ينازعنك في الأمر وادع إلى ربك إنك لعلى هدى مستقيم. It says, to every people have we appointed rites and ceremonies which they must follow. Now, think about this. Why would the Quran say that we have appointed rites and ceremonies which they must follow? In other words, it appears to be unimportant compared to the weightier matters of the law. But the point is that communities have their own ideas, traditions, and so on. But then it goes on to say, let them not dispute with thee on the matter, but summons them and invite them to the way of thy Lord, for thou art assuredly on the right way or the right path. So here it acknowledges truth and it acknowledges falsehood. It acknowledges who is right and who is wrong. And it says that those who are following their own traditions, their own rights, you can't compel them. They have the right to follow it. But you summons them to the way of thy Lord. So again, if people argue that Surah 2 verse 256 is no longer applicable or somehow or the other abrogated, well, note the following. Number one, it's a Medina surah. Number two, even if it doesn't apply, what about Surah 22 verse 67? That's also a Medina surah. Was that abrogated? What about Surah 28 verse 56? Surah 28 verse 56 says, this is a translation by Muhammad Asad, you cannot compel those who you would like to Islam, in other words, in parentheses, but God guides those whom he wills. He has the best knowledge of the guidance. So what clearly the underlying theme from the Quran is a compulsion to a faith. If a person doesn't have given the choice, that's totally unacceptable in Islam. And Surah 2 verse 256 categorically lays that down. And of course, you've got these other particular passages, which obviously seems to indicate the same thing. So with that in mind, and again, this is another point I think was running on your thread. You posted this some time back in respect of what Zakir Naik points out on apostasy. But quite interesting, if you look at certain passages in the Quran, Surah Ma'idah, chapter 5, verse 54, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, O you who believe, should any of you turn back from his religion, then God will bring a people whom he shall love, and they too shall love him. No mention of the death penalty or murder or apostasy. Surah 3, verse 89, those who believe after their believing, those who disbelieve after their believing, it's that's a typographical error, disbelieve after their believing, thereafter increase in their disbelief, their repentance shall not be accepted, and these are they that go astray. Again, no mention of any death penalty for apostasy. Look, note the point. It mentions about people who disbelieve. And then it mentions another step, increasing in their disbelief. Now, how would you increase in your disbelief if the death penalty is basically the punishment for apostasy? How would you even be given an opportunity to increase in your disbelief? So can you note that it gives you various categories, various steps, which defeats the whole notion of the death penalty for apostasy, at least from the Quranic point of view. Surah 3, verse 71, it speaks about a party of the people of the book, Jews, who basically state of our belief in that which has been revealed to those who believe in the first part of the day and apostatize or leave it in the latter part of the day, perhaps then they, Muslims, may apostatize. Now, here's the issue. You had a situation where Jews in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, peace be upon him, stated that they were plotting to have a plan that they accept Islam in the morning and then reject it in the evening. And then, of course, hopefully speaking, Muslims who see this disbelief on their part will then also eventually apostatize. Now think about it. They were very much part and parcel of the Medina community at the initial stages. Why would such a thought have come to their mind if apostasy had been punishable by death? It just simply doesn't make sense, because they had entered into a treaty with the Muslims in Medina. Why would they even contemplate this plan if that was indeed the death penalty was in fact the penalty for apostasy? One can go on. Surah 25, verse 63. Again, this is a Medina surah. Take note. The worshippers of the All-Merciful are they who tread gently upon the earth, and when the ignorant address them, they reply, peace. Again, another Medina surah, Surah 2, verse 177. It is not righteousness that you turn your faces to the east or the west. Righteousness is he who believes in God, the last day, the angel's book, and spends his money for the love of him out of the kindred of orphans and the needy, and importantly, for the liberating the slaves. Now, the word in Arabic is not Oma malakat aymanuhum. The word in Arabic is wasa'ilina wa fi riqab, or raqaba, basically someone who is under the yoke of a, I'm not an Arabic scholar or linguist, but basically it effectively indicates someone who is under some degree of bondage. And particularly, most have translated this as slaves, which is distinct from Oma malakat aymanuhum, which we may deal with later, referring particularly to prisoners of war, which is another category in its entirety. So this is, again, worship God, associate not with him, show kindness to parents and to kindred and to orphan and the needy and the neighbor that is a kinsman and the neighbor that is a stranger and the companion by your side and the wayfarer. Surely Allah loves not the proud and the boastful. Again, this is a Medina surah, Surah 4, verse 36. Now it speaks about neighbors. It speaks about neighbors that are strangers. Who are these people? Are they all Muslims? It speaks about showing kindness to parents and to kindred and to orphans. Does this have to be necessarily Muslims? Now, from that perspective, then we can basically see that there is this initiative in the Quran to, in fact, create a society where people can live with mutual harmony, live with mutual respect, live with a sense of discord, with a sense of respect and peace and love and sharing with each other. And the question I need to ask is that if you're not a Muslim, I'm not asking you to accept the Quran or accept Islam for that particular matter, but if you have a particular presentation or a discourse in terms of which somebody can articulately justify a position that the Quran fundamentally and primarily promotes peace, then would it not be mischievous? Would it not be mischievous to try and prove contrariwise, particularly when the argument that the Quran, in fact, promotes violence is somewhat weak, and in fact, someone that is not even appealed to by extremists, because we'll come to what their justifications are in a short while. Is this not a far more meaningful approach? If 1.5 billion people can theologically justify living in a society where peace should be the ultimate paradigm between themselves, between others, and of course, at a root level with God, then should this not be an approach that we should embrace, as opposed to being an approach that we should oppose? Because why would you want to empower the extremists? Why would we want to empower people who want to take on a violent? It seems to me that either there is an agenda at play, or alternatively, this is just simply a cheap means of evangelization, which is a totally un-Christian approach, I may add. This is not a Christian approach to adopt when you want to basically spread the gospel, trying to show Qur'an is violent, and thereby people need to obviously abandon the Qur'an and accept Christ. That's not the appropriate way in which we deal with each other. So now we come to something called, which basically is in the minds of many people, the idea of jihad. Now, this word jihad, again, and I'm going to be as quick, because that's a topic on its own, it has many meanings. The linguistic meaning means striving, struggling, a struggle for righteousness. An Islamic meaning could mean a non-violent struggling within oneself for a life of virtue. You could mean saying the truth even if it is against one's own interests. It could mean combating to establish justice, which is in fact a supreme goal. I may even add that if you have to take into account Surah 31, but before I go there, you've got many sayings of in terms of the interpretation of how jihad has been used in history. But if you look at it primarily from the Quranic point of view, you look at any Quranic translation. I've got Yusuf Ali here in front of me. We can look at many others. But in particular, Surah Luqman, chapter 31, verse 14. Chapter 31, verse 14, it speaks about God enjoining on man. We have enjoined on man to be good to his parents. In travail upon travail did his mother bear him, and in years twain was his weaning. Show gratitude to me and to thy parents, to me is thy final goal. Then it goes on in verse 15. But if they, who is they? The polytheistic parents, strive to make thee join in worship with me, things of which thou hast no knowledge, obey them not, at least in the aspect of polytheism, but bear them company in this life with justice and follow the way of those who turn to me. In other words, what this verse is saying is that if your polytheistic parents are engaged in duress or struggling to force you to commit shirk or polytheism, then disobey them in respect of that, but obey them and look after them in other aspects. What's quite interesting is that if you look at the Arabic text, the word is وَإِن جَاهَدَاكَ وَإِن جَاهَدَاكَ عَلَى أَن تُشْرِكَ بِمَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِعِلْمٍ. In other words, if one were to transliterate the passage as opposed to translating it, it would mean that if your polytheistic parents are to engage in jihad against you, to force you to commit shirk, then obey them not. Now, the point I'm trying to say is, can you see the generic use of the term jihada, the root meaning of jihad, and of course jihad in different contexts? So this absolutist holy war concept, which people have the idea of, it's totally non-existent in Islamic terminology. In fact, if you look at the Quran, if you look at even the prophetic traditions, the word for holy war is al-harb al-muqaddasatu, holy war. It's unheard of in Islamic theology. There is no such word as al-harb al-muqaddasatu. You will not come across it. You'll come across jihad, jihada, the various roots, and so on, but you don't find this at all. Now, what about jihad in the context of war? Well, here's an interesting book which was pointed out by Shabir Ali recently, and I managed to obtain a copy of the book. It's a book by Darrell Cole, When God Says War is Right, the Christian's perspective on when and how to fight war. And in this, he appeals to St. Ambrose, Augustine, Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas, and John Calvin. And from them, he derives four essential principles in terms of a just war. One, under proper authority. Two, that there has to be some form of just cause. Three, you have to have a righteous intention. And four, that the war itself should in fact be just. Now, I would argue that from the Islamic point of view, at least from the Quranic point of view, because if we would have a debate, is Islam a religion of peace? That's another debate entirely. There is manifestations. You can talk about Islam in history, but we're focusing tonight on primarily the Quran. And so I would appeal to people to let it zero in on that particular issue. And I would argue that if you look at these four principles, these are Christian principles, at least derived from people in Christian history, then you would see that it fulfills that particular definition. Now, let's look at one of the earlier verses on fighting. This is from a Medina surah, Surah 2, verse 190. Again, it's a Medina surah. Take note of that. It says, fight in God's cause against those who wage war against you, but do not commit aggression. So importantly, fight against those who wage war against you. Do not commit aggression. Verily, God does not love the aggressors. And if they desist, in other words, from fighting against you, then behold, God is a much forgiving, a dispenser of grace. Now, the Islamic commentator, Islamic scholar Muhammad Asad, in his commentary points out that this verse lays down unequivocally that only self-defense in the widest sense of the word makes war permissible for Muslims. And so this should be the criteria, that when you look at sometimes other passages of the Quran, you need to juxtapose it with Surah 2 verse 190. Nobody claims that this is abrogated. This is a Medina surah. And so this is the basic premise in terms of which one basically engages in warfare against other people, where there's aggressive warfare being leveled against oneself. And so, again, as I pointed out, jihad can mean the physical effort to exert. The Quran uses the term jihad generically. Muslims and non-Muslims can engage in jihad. In Surah 31, verse 15, in that context, it refers to duress. Here's another individual, Bruce B. Lawrence, in his book, Shattering the Myth, Islam Beyond Violence. I urge some of your viewers to get a copy of this book. When defining jihad, he says, jihad has relevance in modern society, provided it is shorn of the connotation of violence, and is informed by moral privilege, a purpose, justice for the underprivileged. Jihad has come to mean the advocacy of social justice in an increasingly widening circle that also includes economic participation and prosperity for Muslims, and in the modern context, not just for Muslims alone. So it could include justice for non-Muslims. So if you want to form part of the anti-globalization movement, or with Greenpeace and some of these movements that you find. In fact, I find Christian liberation theology, particularly of the Latin American variety, something that I would effectively support. I don't know about other Christians, but certainly what this tells you is that even in the early Muslim community, when you look at the concept of ummah in fact included Muslims, Jews in Medina, and certain segments of Christians when the Medina state was being basically formed. The Arabic words for war is harb, qital. War is repeated 36 times in the Quran, peace repeated 67 times. Do Muslims love war? Prophet Muhammad said the worst name is harb, you can give someone, is war. Why would he say that if he loved war? What about the combat instructions? You see, if you look at, sometimes people want to cherry pick hadith and look at the Surah of Ibn Ishaq and so on and so forth. But just on that point, there were certain rules that were mentioned by the Prophet when engaged in war. One was never kill innocent people. 2, never torture prisoners of war. 3, never kill animals. 4, never destroy crops. 5, never destroy infrastructure. 6, never mutilate bodies of enemies, dead or alive. 7, houses of worship, women, children, and elderly are protected from harm. And lastly, always bury all the dead with respect. Now, this is a standard. This is a criteria. If you're going to find something else in some other material which goes, then we have to obviously deal with that and challenge that based on what we see here. But these would be some of the prime combat instructions of the Prophet when war, in fact, became inevitable. Now, let's come to this notion. I know time is running out. I want to kind of, come to the root part of the issue. When I was dealing with Jay and many others in recent years, the general idea is that, and wrongfully so, is that, and even recently in a debate that I had 2 weeks ago in Potchefstroom, by the way, by an individual who's quite new, but remarkably astute debater, Mike Flew, the idea given is that you've got rule of thumb. The Quran is divided into Meccan and Medina surahs. We don't deny that. And rule of thumb, again, these people would argue that the Medina surahs somehow or the other abrogate the Meccan surahs. And the Medina surahs, obviously, the Meccan surahs, obviously, the latter part of the Quran. The Medina surahs are at the beginning of the Quran. And so the Meccan surahs are, in fact, abrogated by the Medina surahs, rule of thumb. And somehow or the other, the verse that these people use or appeal to is, in Surah 2, verse 106, ما ننسخ من آية أو ننسها نأتي بخير منها أو مثلها ألم تعلم أن الله على كل شيء قدير. And the word is on ما ننسخ من آية. None of our ayah do we cause to abrogate or cause to be forgotten, as Yusuf Ali would translate, but we substitute something which is very similar. Now, there have been many interpretations on this. Some, for example, interpret this as suggesting that there were various categories in the Quran. For example, you'd have a verse of the Quran which says, they ask you about intoxicants, and then say unto them that there is good there's benefit and there's harm, but the harm outweighs the benefit. So they would argue that that would be the first aspect. Then they would say that later on there'd be a verse which says, "Oh, you who believe, approach not worship with a mind that is intoxicated." So they would argue that that's a second step. And then the third step, they would say, well, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu innama al-khamru wal maisiru wal ansabu wal azlamu rijsun min amali shaitan. Oh, you believe, most certainly intoxicants, gambling and idol worship are an abomination of Satan's handiwork. And so these people would argue, well, look, this is one verse abrogating the other verse, although the principle from the other verse applies. But again, and then they would have some people would argue that, look, there are verses of the Quran which abrogate other verses and they're no longer applicable. And then you'd have other people would say, like, there are verses of the Quran which abrogate certain texts of the Quran, and you find this in certain hadith material, like the verse of rajam, of stoning. And they would say that there was a verse at some point in time which promoted the idea of stoning, and now the text is abrogated, which is really nonsensical. And so one of the best understandings and translations has been by Muhammad Asad, based on what Fakhruddin Razi, the classic commentator, says. And he translates this as Surah 2 verse 106. Any message, and he says ayah should be translated as message, which we annul or consign to oblivion, we replace with a better one. Would you perchance ask of the apostle, and then goes on further, subsequent verses, would you perchance ask the apostle who has been sent to you what was asked aforetime of Moses? But whoever chooses to deny the truth instead of believing it has already strayed away from the past. Now note the point. Why would the Quran speak about replacing, and then in the next forthcoming verses speaks about Moses? Well, what's a hint there? And I would argue, and he argues, and many scholars would argue, that the Quran in fact abrogates the previous biblical dispensation, the previous scripture, not its own particular verses. And so you argue that if we read this verse with the previous ones, which states that the Jews and the Christians refuse to accept any revelation which might supersede that of the Bible, for if read in that way, abrogation relates not to the earlier divine messages and not to any part of the Quran itself. And that in fact makes sense, because if you look at Surah 5 verse 47 to 48, the classic lex talionis, you guys know about it. God says it was we, again, as if God is speaking. You may not accept it, but those participants who are here, it was we who revealed the law to Moses. We ordained therein for them the lex talionis, life for life, eye for eye, nose for nose, ear for ear, tooth for tooth, and wounds equal for equal. And then it says, but now, if anyone remits the retaliation by way of charity is an act of atonement in itself, and if any fail to judge by the light we have revealed, they are no better than wrongdoers. Surah 5 verse 47. So can you see that the bottom part of it, but now, in fact, supersedes the one that is previous to it, the lex talionis, eye for eye, nose for nose. There was no room for forgiveness, no room for charity, nothing. No, it was just retaliation. You kill me, I kill you. Or I cannot kill you, but somebody else takes your life. You break my eye, I break your eye, and so on and so forth. And so you find that effectively that Surah 2 verse 106 basically supersedes the previous biblical dispensation. Now, if people have to pull hairs about it and say that, look, that's a fundamental problem, then what would they say again about Surah 16? If you look at Surah 16, I'll just open to Surah 16. Surah 16 verse 101. Forgive me because I left my electronic manual at home. I'm actually in Durban. But if you look at Surah 16 verse 101, it says, وَإِذَا بَدَّلْنَا آيَةً مَكَانَ آيَةٍ وَاللَّهُ أَعْلَمُ بِمَا يُنَزِّلُ قَالُوا إِنَّمَا أَنْتَ مُفْتَرٍ بَلْ أَكْثَرُهُمْ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ. And the translation, and here Yusuf Ali gets a context, when we substitute one revelation for another, and God knows best what he reveals in stages, they say thou art but a forger, but most of them understand not. Now, not the point. Not the point. We were given the idea that the Medina surahs abrogate the Meccan surahs, right? But now, interestingly enough, Surah 16, Surah Nahl, which mentions again also this idea of substitution. If you look at it, it is a Meccan surah. So how does it make sense now that a Meccan surah now is speaking about abrogation, when the Medina surahs was to mention abrogation of the surahs or previous surahs, and then you have the substitution taking place. Here it speaks about a verse which people quote to give the idea that this basically abrogates the previous verse. But in fact, what you find here is this verse, in fact, was revealed in Mecca. So again, it's a self-defeating argument people have. So the abrogation is of the biblical dispensation, not verses of the Quran. Now let's come to some of the verses of fighting. Let's look at some of the first verses that were revealed on fighting. One of the first verses was in Surah 22, verse 39 to 40. Well, actually, permission is only given to those on whom war is being waged or under attack, in parentheses, because they are oppressed. And surely God is able to assist them, those who are driven from their homes that are just cause, except that they say, our Lord is God. And if God did not repel some people with others, cloisters, churches, synagogues, mosques in which God's name is much remembered would be destroyed. Now, this is the very first verse in the Quran that was revealed on fighting. Surah 22, verse 39 to 40. It is a Medina surah. And as you can see, the very first verse on fighting speaks about effectively fighting to preserve the freedom of religion. Now, can anyone have a problem with that? It speaks about God not repelling. I don't care what Muslims did in history. They may have destroyed churches. And of course, you have instances where people do, but I'm speaking about what the Quran says here. Cloisters, churches, and synagogues, God does not repel some people with others, and you'd find that effectively these places of worship would be destroyed. That's the first verse. What about the second verse? The second verse, which I quoted, Surah 2, verse 190, fight in the way of God, those who fight you, but be not aggressors. Now, why would people, for example, engage and cut it out and say fight in the way of God, and then try and promote the idea that this is violent? Surah 2, verse 190, be not aggressors as God love. And we can read the whole verse when we have the time, when we engage each other. One of the third verses, Surah 4, verse 75. And you need to understand that the Quran was not revealed piecemeal as you see it here. There's a sporadic forms of revelation. So the form and the manner in which we have the Quran now is not in the way it was revealed. Why should you not fight in the cause of God and of the utterly oppressed men and women and children who are crying, let us forth to freedom out of a land whose people are tyrants, and raise for us out of thy grace one who will bring us succor, one who will bring us liberation. Again, fighting for liberating humanity for tyrants. So does anyone have a problem with this verse? Does anyone have a problem with this verse? Does anyone have a problem with this verse? I cannot see the issue. But what people would choose to do is what we would engage in, what I would call the cherry-picking fallacy, where you just simply pick cherries to suit you. And people do this all the time. I see this all the time happening, the cut and paste syndrome. So Surah 2, verse 190, fight unbelievers. Surah 8, verse 60, terrify the enemies of God. Surah 9, verse 5, popular verse. If we have time, I hope to get to that. Slay the unbelievers. Surah 9, verse 29, fight Jews and Christians. Surah 47, verse 3, cut the heads of infidels. In fact, 47, verse 3, and this was thrown to me numerous times. Jay did it in 2012. You can check the debate on YouTube. And I said that if that was the case, that would mean effectively that every Muslim who sees a non-Muslim needs to cut the heads of non-Muslims. I mean, that's a kind of warped logic that people would want to have. And yet, when you look at that particular chapter, it speaks about, in the context of warfare and battlefield. And then afterwards, when the war lays down its guns, now is a time for ransom or letting prisoners go free. So why would people choose to engage in the cherry-picking fallacy? Why would they do that? And that's a question people need to ask. And I know that there are lots of sincere Christians that I come across that don't do this, that want to understand the other side. But this is a kind of argumentation that you get, from people from the atheistic community that have absolutely no respect for religious texts. Why incorporate this means of argumentation, this low-level type of argumentation, when you want to deal with the other side? Why not at least read the entire verse in context? Don't engage in the cherry-picking fallacy. So let's look at this. That a fundamental principle you'd find when people engage in eisegesis, not exegesis, as would be tafsir. Verses in the Quran must also, in certain instances, be understood in the context of what we would call the asbab al-nuzul, or the chain in which they were revealed, and in also conjunction with other verses delineating the rules of warfare. So, for example, Surah 2, verse 190 lays down a standard. You have to juxtapose that with other passages of the verses in the Quran, which also deal with warfare and violence for that particular matter. You need to look at it in its whole, not in its isolationist form and engaging in a form of eisegesis. So let's look at one classic example, Surah 9, verse 29. Yeah, this comes out quite often. In fact, I may add that this is possibly or probably one of the only verses in the Quran where the context is not explicitly provided. That's a key point. But effectively, what it says قاتلوا الذين لا يؤمنون بالله ولا باليوم الآخر ولا يحرمون ما حرم الله ورسوله ولا يدينون دين الحق من الذين أوتوا الكتاب. Important, من الذين أوتوا الكتاب, even amongst the people of the book, a specific category which is mentioned in Arabic, until they pay. So basically it means, to give you a translation, fight those who believe not in God. This is from Ali's translation. Nor the last day, nor hold that forbidden which had been forbidden by God and his apostle. Nor acknowledge the religion of truth, even if they are the people of the book, until they pay the jizya with willing submission and then find themselves duly subdued. Now, something which was mentioned by Shabir Ali recently in the debate that I've seen is that he made quite an interesting point. Primarily, and this is universally understood, so it's not me, universally understood by both Muslim and non-Muslim scholars of the Quran, that this primarily refers to Jews and Christians. But quite interestingly enough, in the beginning of this passage, it says, fight those who believe not in God or the last day. Now think about it. Generally speaking, which Christians believe, or which Christians do not believe in God? Which Christians do not believe in the last day? So is it possible then, as he argued, that this basically refers to a specific category of Christians or people who appropriated Christianity? And we find in history, we do have a situation where people appropriated Christianity, and that would be effectively the Roman Church and the Byzantine Empire. And I'm sure that many people here on this forum don't consider the Roman Church to be Christian. And people like Constantine, for example, some would say that he was shouting and bleaching the name of Sol Invictus on his deathbed. Was he a Christian, even though he appropriated and amalgamated Christianity as part of his empire? So this could be, and so based on that, and also based on the history of this verse, universally there is a consensus that this in fact deals with the expedition of Tabuk. Now, what does the expedition of Tabuk deal with? It dealt with the fact that the Byzantines were out to basically destroy Muslims. No fighting, in fact, occurred. And Muslims, in fact, returned back. And what also people fail to understand is that if this is a universal passage or verse to attack Jews and Christians, because many people, the problem I have is that misguided critics who happen to come across that verse show it to people who know little about Islam. And these people who know little about the Quran then start spreading it and sharing it on their forums, and you have these memes all the time. And that gives the impression that effectively Islam sanctions the killing of Jews and Christians all the time. But it's important to get away from that and move to the more authentic sources, and you do this by reading and collecting information from Muslims rather than the Islamophobes who spread their hate. So if you were to, for example, go to a Nazi to learn about Judaism, would you go to a Nazi to learn about Judaism, or would you go to a Jew to learn about Judaism? But this is basically the background. One particular commentator, Mujahid, reported concerning this verse, fight those who do not believe. It was revealed when Muhammad and his companions combined with the expedition of Tabuk. Now what happened? The expedition of Tabuk was preceded by the Battle of Mu'tah, which began when an emissary of the Prophet was assassinated while delivering a letter to a Roman ally. Again, this is universally acknowledged. There's no dispute on this. There was an individual called Al-Harith ibn Umair al-Azdi. He was sent on an errand to carry a letter to the ruler of Basra. And on his way back, he was intercepted by Sharhabil ibn Amr al-Ghassani, who was the governor of Al-Balqa and a close ally to Caesar. Now, Caesar is a generic term. That was actually the Emperor Heraclius, who was the Byzantine Empire. And what happened to this emissary is that he was tied up and he was effectively beheaded by Al-Ghassani. He was tied up, beheaded, and left basically to be mutilated by the wild animals in the Zad al-Ma'ad. Now, here's the point. Executing emissaries from a country, other countries, is a war crime. It's a war crime today. It could never be committed by anyone who sincerely believed in God. And you need to understand that this is a primitive society. These are primitive people. They never had diplomats, United Nations coming together to basically meet together and see how to resolve a particular conflict. These were effectively primitive people. And so executing emissaries is a war crime. That was the first act of Roman aggression that led to the expedition of Tabuk. What was the second act? The second act is that the Romans had in fact concentrated large forces on the outskirts of Syria. And here the Emperor Heraclius had in fact disbursed a year's salary to his soldiers. And there were other surrounding forces that had basically joined hands with him, and they had sent bank cards to Al-Balqa. And then the Prophet, of course, summoned them. So there were two acts of aggression. So they were dealing with the Byzantine power. That was the greatest military force on earth at the time. It was a brutal dictatorship. And they were basically showing an unjustifiable opposition to Muslims. Now, what were the early Muslim community to do? Were they going to sit back? Were they going to basically lie in wait? Were they going to basically lie down and become sitting ducks for the Byzantines to come and destroy them? No, they went out to meet them. But then there was no fighting. Now, if they wanted to fight them, they would have gone and marched all the way to Rome. Why didn't they do that? No, because the threat had been averted, and so they stopped. One interesting point is that there was no hostility that the Muslims showed towards the Byzantines, because if you look at Surah Rum, chapter 30, there is a prophecy which deals with the defeat of the defeat of the Romans by the Persians. And then there's a prediction of the Qur'an that the Romans would defeat the Persians in a few years' time. Now, when that news, according to the classical material, came to the Prophet of the defeat of the Byzantines, we were told that he was sad. Why would he be saddened? Because they would have been the closest, religiously at least, nominally speaking, to the Muslims in terms of their particular belief system, even though it may have been false, at least from the perspective of the fact that the Byzantines never really, Heraclius was probably not a true Christian in the true sense of the word. The other point is that if people want to, throw Surah 9:29, then they need to go to Surah 5 verse 35, because Surah 5 verse 35 says, when dealing with actual Christian believers, nearest to those amongst the Muslims, وَلَتَجِدَنْ أَقْرَبَهُمْ مَوَدَّةً لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا الَّذِينَ قَالُوا إِنَّنَا نَصَارَى ذَلِكَ بِأَنَّ مِنْهُمْ قِسِّيسِينَ وَرُهْبَانًا وَأَنَّهُمْ لَا يَسْتَكْبِرُونَ. That nearest to the believers will thou find those who say we are Christian, because amongst them are men who are devoted to learning, men who renounce the will, and people who are not arrogant. Now, can you see there is a friendly hand being basically lent out? Why is it that people choose to look at certain passages historically? And so I would argue that in a nutshell, Surah 9 verse 29 is historically specific. There are verses in the Quran which are historically specific, dealing with particular incidences in the time of the Prophet, and so cannot be universally applied in the context of the 20th century. So that's Surah 9 verse 29. What about, and in a nutshell, I've kind of given a summary. What about Surah 9? And I know time is running out, Jonathan, so I'm going to try and wrap up as quickly as possible. But I'll try and extend the interaction, if that's possible, for a longer period. If you look at Surah 9 verse 5, Surah 9 verse 5 again is the classic, at least those who don't know, but the classic cut and paste syndrome that people internalize and want to promote the idea that, I mean, I even see people like, people in the know, and I know this individual, Robert Spencer from Jihad Watch, because this is his kind of pet topic. And when quoting Surah 9 verse 5, he says, when the forbidden months are past, slay the unbelievers wherever you find them. Now, at the very outset, one will basically note that it doesn't even speak about unbelievers generically, the kuffar. It doesn't. It speaks about particularly the mushrikeen, the polytheists. Now, if you take into account that this was revealed to the Prophet in the 6th century, who were the mushrikeen at that time? It was not the Hindus, it was not the Jews and the Christians. Well, the Quran refers to them as people of the book. It was the only people were the polytheists of Mecca. Now, was this verse a universal declaration to go out and slay unbelievers? Well, let's look at Surah 9 verse 5 and see what it says. When the forbidden months are past, fight and slay the pagans wherever you find them. Seize them, beleaguer them, lie in wait for them in every stratagem of war. But if they repent and establish regular prayers and practice charity, then open the way for them. God is oft forgiving, most merciful. So effectively what it says, you fight and kill the polytheists wherever you find them, except those who then repent, they establish salah and then pay the zakat. Then you basically deal with them appropriately and you leave them. That's a kind of, I get kind of bogged down in a sense of mortified why people would want to bastardize this particular chapter so often. And the answer is that it's a classic. If you take it up in its classic isolationist sense, it will make you say what you wanted to say. If I were to quote Nixon in isolation saying kill the Vietnamese, and then you superimpose it in the 21st century and tell the Americans, this is what Richard Nixon says, kill the Vietnamese, and you go and kill Vietnamese, you're divorcing the actual quotation from the historical context, not to justify the Vietnam War. It was brutal, barbaric. But the point is that there was a background behind what he effectively said. Now, what is the background behind Surah 9? Well, the background starts from verse 1. So why do people not look at verse 1? Verse 1 speaks about a peace treaty that was entered into between pagans and Muslims. Again, there's no dispute on this particular issue. In fact, Surah 9 verse 1 speaks about a declaration of immunity. From now on, God has announced an immunity to those of the pagans with whom you have contracted mutual alliance. So basically, the pagans were repeatedly breaking the treaty, and God declares an immunity necessitated by repeated treaty violations by the pagans. However, there were two pagan tribes, the Bani Damra and the Bani Hanana, that adhered to their treaties. So what was to happen in respect of them? In respect of them, Surah 9, verse 4, those treaties that are not dissolved with those pagans with whom you have entered into a mutual alliance and have not subsequently failed you in aught, nor aided anyone against you, fulfill your engagements with them to the end of their term. So can you see that there are exceptions to the declaration of immunity? There were two types of pagans: those who broke their treaties, they violated the treaties, attacked in warfare, engaged in the hostile behavior towards you, and those who did not. So those who did not, you basically fulfilled the peace treaty with them on mutual terms. So the two exceptions to the declaration of immunity were the pagans like the Bani Damra and the Bani Hanana who remained true to their obligations. Muslims would have fulfilled their covenant with them, the covenant of peace and security. And there was another category as well. Those pagans who broke and violated the treaty but sought protection. In Surah 9 verse 5, those same pagans, in verse 6 it says that if any one of the pagans, that is those who broke their treaty, asks you for asylum, then grant it to him. So Muslims were to protect those pagans who sought protection. So effectively, then what were the aggravating circumstances which led to Surah 9 verse 5? Well, again, the Quran provides the context, but you need to read on. That's a point, folks. Read on further. Surah 9 verse 13. Will you not fight people who, A, broke their oaths? That's the first point. B, aimed at the expulsion of the Prophet. C, attacked you first. Do you fear them? But God has more right that you should fear him if you are believers. Surah 9 verse 8, they respect neither ties of relationship nor keep their covenants in your case. So can you see, these are the people that whom Surah 9 verse 5 in fact refers to. But all it needs is reading into the text and reading into the background and understanding the point. So those pagans like the Bani Damra who fulfilled their treaty, you were to fulfill your treaty with them. Those who broke their treaty, violated the treaty, but later on sought protection, you are to protect them. So these were the two exceptions of the Declaration of Immunity. So Surah 9 verse 5 is not a blanket, all-out attack on just murdering and massacring polytheists. And anyone who does that or wants to basically promote that idea is effectively engaging in a mischievous agenda. And I need to ask the question, why? Why would you do this? Why would people choose to do this repeatedly? And not only that, let me give you the George Sale translation after Surah 9 verse 6. Now, bear in mind, before 9 verse 6, it speaks about fighting those polytheists, right? Look at what George Sale says. If any of those pagans, that is those who broke their treaty, seek thy protection, protect him till he hears the word of God. And not only that, convey him to a secure environment. Now, in rules of war, if you look at rules of war, we can talk about Guantanamo Bay. We know how people treat prisoners of war. But here it speaks about taking him to a secure environment if he asks for your protection, seeks your protection. And not only that, Sale goes on to say, you shall give him safe conduct that he may return home safely in case he shall not think fit to embrace Mohammedanism, meaning Islam. In other words, if he doesn't want to embrace Islam, but he asks for your protection, then not only that, but you secure and send him home safely. And of course, there are other conditions. If people want to accept Islam and want to establish worship and so on, that's obviously a condition that averts it. But look at this particular point here. Those pagans who broke their treaty and now asking for your protection, then you protect him. And not only protect him, but convey him to a place which is secure. And if he doesn't want to accept Islam, then you make sure that he goes on. I quoted George Sale. Why I quoted George Sale? I try to show that the worst translation you could possibly get, the most biased translation, if you read even the most biased translation, you'd come to the similar conclusion on this particular point. And so it's important, folks, that let's not engage in the cherry-picking fallacy. We would not want to do that with the Bible. We'd respect that. You know, and I would urge people to, when looking at the Quran, don't engage in what we would call the cut and paste syndrome, because it's a very dishonest form of engagement. Rather read it in its entirety and then look at it in the background. And again, Surah 9 verse 7. How can there be an agreement between the pagans with God and his messenger, except with those whom you made an agreement at the sacred mosque? So long as they are true to you, to be true to them. Surely God loves those who do their duty. So again, can you see the exceptions here? This is not an all-out, but people who want to quote Surah 9 verse 5 obviously have an an ulterior agenda. Surah 47 verse 4, which I discussed earlier. When you meet in battle, again, the context is battle. Those who reject faith, smite their necks. Well, what do you do? In the 6th century, there were no guns. When people were fighting, you would fight with swords, you would fight with armors, you would fight with bows and arrows. That would be the most critical part of a man's body in times of warfare, smite their necks. But it doesn't mean killing unbelievers en masse in sale. Then when you have overcome them, make them prisoners, and afterwards, in brackets, and set them free as a favor, because that's a context, or for a ransom till the war lays down its burden. Now, people quote this all the time to give the indication, Surah 47 verse 4, cut the heads of the unbelievers. Then that'll be juxtaposed with the picture of Jihadi John cutting off the head of a journalist and say, well, can you see the similarities? This is what the Quran says. This is what now Muslims are doing. And if they are doing that, if they are appealing, if these extremists, for the sake of argument, I'm not saying they are, but if they are appealing to these verses on that basis, then it basically puts those in the same camp. It puts the extremists in the same camp with the polemicists, because the polemicists and that minority group of individuals or Muslims who may hold to these extreme ideas, and I'm not saying it's because of the Quran, but if they are, then they would be in the same camp as those who basically want to promote the idea that the Quran is bankrupt. And effectively, what it means is that if you're promoting that idea, then you yourself are bankrupt. You yourself are morally bankrupt and scripturally bankrupt, and also intellectually bankrupt, because why would one want to come persistently with these ideas? I would also note that in almost every debate that I've discussed, when these particular passages are explained, in the rebuttal session, nobody comes back with another discussion. Then they want to go to secondary sources, you want to go to hadith, you want to now go to Ibn Ishaq. But let's deal with what we've got here in what we are dealing with. I believe in sola scriptura. You believe in sola scriptura. Let's go to our roots. Let's compare apples with apples. Let's not compare apples with oranges. Let's compare the Quran and the Bible. You don't compare the Bible now with the Quran and other works and so on. Let's play a fair game here. So why Musco to give the indication that you kill every unbeliever that you meet, when in fact the verse doesn't say it? So, and last verse. So a fundamental principle again, Jonathan, is that the Quranic exegesis, not eisegesis, verses must be understood in the context in which they are revealed, in conjunction with other verses. Surah 48 verse 1, Inna fatahna laka fathan mubina. We have granted you a manifest victory. Now, what was the manifest victory? Was it a conquest? Was it the conquest of Mecca? Was it the Battle of Badr? Was it the Battle of Ahad? What was the manifest victory? The manifest victory here was the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. And what was the Treaty of Hudaybiyah? It was a peace treaty which effectively put the Muslims on a plane of prejudice, because it now ushered in peace between the Muslims and the polytheistic pagans from Mecca. But it basically meant that the Muslims were going to perform the pilgrimage, now had to turn back. They had to come back another year. Now imagine, there were no transports or journeys or aeroplanes back then. They walked on foot to Mecca, on the gates of Mecca, and they were refused entry. The second category was that the polytheists refused to accept that the Prophet is a messenger of God. When in the treaty he said Muhammad Rasulullah, they refused to accept it. In fact, the companions of the Prophet stated that we cannot abide by this treaty. This treaty is prejudicial to us. And yet he abode by this treaty. And the Quran describes it as a manifest victory. Why? Why would a treaty that is prejudicial to the Muslim community in the 6th century, resulting in them now turning back, going back to Medina, being viewed as a manifest victory? Why? It's because of the fact that it ushered in a term of peace between the polytheists and the Meccans. So obviously one of the last passages, again a Medina surah, that was basically revealed. So this basically tells you where we have in the Quran. And so I'm going to conclude on this particular point and ask the question, for example, are ISIS recruits motivated by religious fervor and faith? Didier Francois was a French journalist. He was held by ISIS in Syria for 10 months before being released in April 2014. He was interviewed by Christian Manpour. And when she was asked about his time, this is what he said. He said they didn't even have the Quran. Journalists held hostage by ISIS for 10 months. There was never really a discussion about text. It was not a religious discussion. It was a political discussion. It was more hammering what they believed than teaching us about the Quran, because it has nothing to do with the Quran. They didn't even want to give us a Quran. Lee Ross in 1977 coined the phrase fundamental attribution error, which refers to the phenomenon in which we place excessive emphasis on internal motivations to explain the behavior of others in any given situation, rather than considering the relevant external factors. Why do people always assume that when Muslims commit violence, it's internally because of their particular inclination or the violence in their religion? but not the other hand around. Polish-born psychiatrist, he worked with the CIA in the 80s, worked closely with Afghan. He sees religion as a useful analytical prism through which you view the rise of ISIS, etc. He says religion has a role, but it is a role of justification. It's not why they do this or why young people go there. To give themselves a bit more legitimacy, they use Islam as a justification. It's not about religion, it's about identity. You identify with the victims, with the guys being killed by your enemies. And this last particular point, Ali H. Safan, he wrote a book called The Black Banners, the inside story of 9/11 and the war against Al-Qaeda. He says, when I first began interrogating Al-Qaeda members, I found that while they could quote bin Laden's sayings by heart, I knew far more of the Quran than they did. And in fact, some barely knew classical language. Far from being religious zealots, a large number of those involved in terrorism do not even practice their faith regularly. Many lack religious literacy and could be regarded as religious novices. And an MI5 study showed that there was a disproportionate number of these converts and who were accepting Islam. They had a high propensity for drug taking, drinking alcohol, visiting prostitutes. Muhammad Atta, one classic example. What did he do before 9/11? Well, strip clubs, liquor, hard liquor, gambling excursions. We have this individual here, Olaki. This is what happened to him in 1996, and he was subsequently killed, I think in 2011 by the United States through a drone attack somehow in the other in Yemen. And this is at the height of his career when he was an imam in Washington. And of course, he's seen by many people to effectively chain terror. So the point at the end of the day, in conclusion, folks, is that when we look at any religious scripture, when we look at any text, when we look at the Quran, let's approach these books, let's approach our religious texts with a degree of respect. Let's effectively respect one another. Let's not engage in the cherry-picking fallacy, and let the book speak for itself. And if Muslims basically can effectively, as I believe I have done, provide, and I believe many people much more better than I don't consider myself a scholar in any sense of the word, but many people more better than I, we can make out a reasonable and an appropriate context in terms of which we can show and illustrate that the Quran primarily promotes peace and does not promote aggressive violence. Why not embrace this? Why not embrace this approach and join us on the journey of, in fact, using this as a theological justification, whereby we can show that these books, in fact, call you to engage in peace. If you're engaging in violence and you effectively distorting, atomizing your scripture and doing the most evil form of destruction and bastardization of your own particular religious text. And so I'll leave it at that. I'd hand it over to you, Jonathan, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Yusuf. Folks, this is the interactive portion of the program. If you would like to interact with our guest speaker, Yusuf Ismail, and ask questions, make comments, express disagreements, raise objections, then simply click the raise hand button, and I will promote you to be a co-panelist with Yusuf and give you an opportunity to interact and dialogue with him. I see we have 2 hands raised currently. Let's bring out Chris from Canada. Greetings, Chris. You're on live with Yusuf Ismail.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Jonathan. And hello, Yusuf. How are you doing?
Hi there, Chris. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the presentation, too. A very knowledgeable individual you are. But first off, I noticed that you were talking about propaganda at the start of your session. And then you were quoting Fox News and CNN as evidence or something. Wouldn't you say that Fox News and CNN is a lot of propaganda? And if so, why would you have used it?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. What the point was I was giving, when you're speaking about propaganda and the means in which propaganda is used, certainly sometimes you may have factual distortions, but what I was speaking about propaganda was propaganda on a more sophisticated level. Now, generally speaking, if you see news reports as they appear, they would basically, for example, appear to give you factual reports of certain instances or certain happenings that basically occur. But the propaganda basically lies when analysts and spin doctors come onto the scene. So I wasn't specifically referring to the news report. I mean, the aspect of Olaki, it's not just Fox News. I just gave a a particular clip on Fox News there, which I had pasted on my PowerPoint. But I mean, this is universally known. So it was effectively repeating a factual aspect that was there. And the aspect about Didier Francois and the interview that he conducted with CNN's Christian Amanpour, again, I was just simply relaying a factual information in terms of what was basically reported. So when I'm speaking of propaganda, I'm not basically referring, to reports that can be verified in other news medias. I mean, it's common cause. The interview with Didier Francois on CNN, that can be viewed on YouTube. You can see his particular writings. What I was referring to, the sophisticated level of propaganda that would accompany, for example, the news report. So, for example, if you have a report about an act of violence that may be committed by a Muslim, we'll accept that. That's fine. But then you'd get, the Sean Hannitys, and you'd get the O'Reillys that would come and provide their own spin, and they'd basically get people like Bridget Gabriel and Robert Spencer and Pamela Geller and so on to provide a particular nuanced interpretation of the events. Or you see, well, the individual who's involved in the Florida bombing basically shouted Allahu Akbar, and he appealed to some degree of allegiance to ISIS. So that means this is another classical example in terms of how Islam is coming in, taking over our societies and so on. So there's propaganda on two levels. So I use those particular slides incidentally, but the reports can basically be verified. So the background to al-Awlaki can effectively be verified on Wikipedia. You can even look at his historical background, even online, not only on Fox News, but some of the other mainstream journalists, news media as well. I was referring to propaganda at a more sophisticated and subtle level, and particularly the interpretative spin that is given to news events and reports.
Yeah, no problem. I'm not basing my my questions on that. It's just something that I picked up at the end of the presentation. That's all. But within your presentation, it seemed that you appealed to a legal system to allow people to live in peace. Would you say that this would be Sharia law?
Well, again, you have to define what you mean by Sharia law, because Sharia law has many interpretations. There is no clear, and this is a problem, I would admit it's an internal problem in Muslim society. Sharia law has no clear definition in the context of the 21st century. And why do I say this? Because if you look at, again, the root word, the generic word, لِكُلِّ جَعَلْنَا شِرْعَةً وَمِنْهَاجًا, we have indeed opened a minhaj, an open way. Sharia literally means an opening watering path to the hole, or opening path to the watering hole, in a manner of speaking. And over the centuries, it has come to mean Islamic law. Now, again, what Islamic law is can have many meanings in different contexts. But the general understanding of Sharia law today, if you look at it in a conventional orthodox fashion, would mean the fiqhi legislation. Now, what do I mean by that? Fiqhi legislation is the juristic interpretation of classical jurists as they basically looked at the primary sources of Islam, the Qur'an and the prophetic paradigm, and then developed the law in accordance with that particular period. Now, here is where the problem arises. People speak about Sharia law as being a divine law, when in actual fact it's not divine law if you want to look at it, because effectively the vast majority of Sharia law comprise of jurisprudence. This is what happened in history. When Muslim jurisprudence, that is fiqh, when it acquired its systematic juristic form, and I mentioned this earlier in my presentation, particularly during the Abbasid period, it incorporated the logic of Muslim imperialism at that particular point in time. So, for example, when you look at some of the classical fuqaha like Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Shafi, Imam Malik, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, these individuals who were framers of the law were not in a sense rulers in society. So what they did was they looked at the Quran, they looked at the Sunnah, they looked at the Hadith, which was not, it was in fact non-existent at that time, but they developed the law in accordance with their particular time and their context. Now, since the developers of the law were not rulers in society, the inherent framers of the law could not identify where the flaws existed, if there were flaws, if any. And what happened over a particular period of time is that Muslim society invented this whole notion of taqleed, which means blind following, because over a period of time, systematically, Muslim communities were interpreting the law in accordance with their own whims and fancies. So they said, no, look, this law needs to be now codified. And so the juristic interpretation of the classical jurists was then codified and became truncated and stuck in history. And that's what he effectively interpreted. So when
Right,
Muslim
but like I was dealing with though, so
but let me finish this point.
The highway robberies, in Islam, it commands that highway robbers should be crucified or mutilated, and we see that in September of 2003,
one point. I'll deal with Surah 5 verse 33. I'll deal with Surah 5
I just want to be able to substantiate what I'm saying here first.
Okay, but
in September 2003, Scotsman Sandy Mitchell faced crucifixion in Saudi Arabia. He was beaten, tortured until he confessed to a crime he did not commit, a bomb plot masterminded by the British Embassy. The article says that of this punishment, that is the worst kind of execution, that the two has been carried out in the last 20 years. Also in 2002, Amnesty International reports that even though Saudi Arabia ratified the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment Convention Against Torture in October of 1997, amputation is prescribed under both Hudud punishments and Qisas law of retaliation. Also, AI has recorded 33 amputations and 9 cross amputations where the alternate hand or foot is mutilated. And of course, we could quote Surah 5:33 down to 34 for that.
Okay, Chris, can I come in? Because you just interrupted me on a key point. I'm coming to Surah 5 verse 33, but you raised the issue of Sharia effectively. And now let me just finish on that particular point. When Muslim countries today, and I will come to Surah 5 verse 33, but when Muslim countries today then talk about imposing the Sharia, the contradictions that are inherent in the formulation of that particular jurisprudence effectively come to the fore. And so you therefore find, for example, manifestations of Sharia. For example, even the way that the Sharia is applied in certain countries, when people talk about imposing Islamic Sharia, it is imposing Islamic punishments or the hudud. The hudud are the outer limits of the particular system. And so if someone were to basically impose a Sharia, and by imposing the Sharia, basically engaging in punishment and amputation and crucifying and all of that, what you're talking about, and in fact, crucifixion was never historically. There's no historical precedent for crucifixion in Islamic history. But be that as it may, when people start imposing the Sharia or talk about imposing the Sharia, there are multiple interpretations of what Sharia is. Now, you raised Surah 5 verse 33, and I know Khalif K. Karim interestingly pointed out that basically refers specifically to dacoits and highway robbers. And in fact, there is a hadith which is seemingly seems to indicate that. But let's look at Surah 5 verse 33. And I'm going to basically show you how even that interpretation is not entirely correct. Now, Chris, you don't know Arabic, right? I take it as a given that you don't effectively know Arabic as a subject. But if you open Surah 5 verse 33, and I'm giving you this particular translation here by Asad. Surah 5 verse 33 says the following, and we'll unpack it and break it down. It says, إِنَّمَا جَزَاءُ الَّذِينَ يُحَارِبُونَ اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ وَيَسْعُونَ فِي الْأَرْضِ فَسَادًا أَن يُقَتَّلُوا أَوْ يُصَلَّبُوا أَوْ تُقَطَّعَ أَيْدِيهِمْ وَأَرْجُلُهُم مِّنْ خِلَافٍ أَوْ يُنفَوْا مِنَ الْأَرْضِ. Now, the conventional interpretation or translation of this has been, and I'm going to just give from memory, is that the punishment of those who wage war against God and his apostle. How do you wage war against God? Well, by waging war against a representative of God, meaning the apostle. You're waging war against God. The punishment is execution or crucifixion, or having the hands and feet cut off from opposite ends. So the conventional orthodox interpretation would mean that this basically refers to particular individuals who wage war against God, wage war against his apostle, and of course engage in highway robbery. However, as many people noted, and particularly if you look at Asad's translation, and even as he cites Fakhruddin Razi, he translates this passage as, and I want you to hear this, and I want you to understand this. He says that this passage is translated as follows: it is but a just recompense for those who make war on God and his apostle and endeavor to spread corruption on earth, that they are being slain in great numbers and are crucified in great numbers, or have, in result of their perverseness, their hands or their feet cut off in great numbers. Now, what's the significance of the word great numbers being used here in the translation? Basically, he goes on to say, that's Asad, that the word yuqattalu does not mean somebody being slain. It's not a direct imperative to slay, but rather it's referring to an incident of people being slain in great numbers, being crucified in great numbers, or being, as a result of their perverseness, their hands or their feet executed or cut off in great numbers. And so on that basis, he argues that obviously that this basically is a commentary, if you like, of the existing society in 6th century Arabia, where as a result of sanguinary warfare, in fact, he goes on, and I'll give you the quotation, the attempt of the commentators to interpret the above as a legal injunction must be rejected because, in fact, the term or the verse itself is not is to be read in the present tense, not in the future tense. If you look at Arabic grammar, an Arabic grammarian will tell you that this particular verse should be read in the present tense and not in the future tense, not as an injunction. Because effectively, you're reading in the present tense, what it would mean, it would effectively suggest that the hostility to ethical imperatives causes them to lose sight of their moral values. So this basically deals with people engaging in forms of sanguinary warfare, as a result of which they are being executed in great numbers. They are being crucified in great numbers. I may also add that if crucifixion was a punishment in Islam, then nowhere in Islamic history do we have a single precedent where anyone was basically crucified. You don't have it. I don't point out to ISIS or anything like that. I'm talking about in classical Islamic history. Despite all the flaws and the warts and the violence that you may have seen, there is no such case. So what he argues is that that particular verse should be read in the present tense. There is a similar verse in the Quran in Surah 20, Surah Taha, where Fir'aun, uses the same particular verse, and in that context, he uses it in the future tense, meaning this is a penalty that he's going to impose upon the magicians in his tribe when they basically accepted the authority of Moses. And so how can God and Pharaoh, who is described in the Quran as the enemy of God, have the same kind of injunctions binding upon them? So again, no, this is not a legal injunction. Those who see it as a legal injunction, and there's a school of thought in Islam that see it as a legal injunction, would argue that it applied to highway robbers, it applied to dastardly, it applied to people who engage in acts of violence, and so this is a penalty applied to them. And by virtue of the fact that they are engaging in war against the Prophet and God and the Muslim community. But I would disagree with that. I would disagree, and I would go with what the Arabic linguists would tell me, that in fact this is not a legal injunction, but rather it should be viewed in the present tense, and it basically is an indication of what is happening. And so coming back to the initial question you asked, when you speak about Sharia law, don't again look at it in isolation. What you are doing, you seem to be a smart man, Chris, but the kind of argumentation that you're presenting here is a kind of argumentation that I'm going to get from the average man on the street. And I don't think you are the average man on the street. I think you are read, unless you get material from other sources. But I think go beyond the conventional stereotype. Sharia law, there is no book called Sharia law in Islam. Sharia has many manifestations, many meanings. Even the notion of what constitutes Sharia is being constantly debated, even in today's society. And I agree with you that there needs to be an overhaul of Sharia in the conventional sense that we as Muslims understand it. And that means that a vast majority of the jurisprudence that is truncated and comes from the 11th and the 12th century, which we've inherited, we need to look at it and, of course, effectively engage in a constant interpretative relationship with the text of the Quran and our sources. So I hope that basically deals with the issue that you raised. Hello, Jonathan. Are you there? Am I still on?
Yes. Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay.
So what you're saying is people in Islam that basically agree with Surah 533 the way I do in how I presented it, you just disagree with.
No, I didn't say that. I said there are two schools of interpretation. The one school of interpretation, in fact, I've got, I had it online, but
I was going to say, you just said though that there is Muslims that do view it this way.
Yeah,
and you just view it a different way. So does that mean you just disagree with them?
No, but there's a qualifier there. You missed the qualifier. The Muslims who agree that it's a legal injunction say that it basically applies to highway robbers, and in fact, they even
that's exactly what I presented, though.
No, but the point is that that would not be an entirely accurate translation and interpretation of the verse, because if you look at the Arabic,
so you're saying those Muslims that say that are wrong then?
Well, I would argue that they would not be entirely accurate. I would say that they would be wrong. I would argue that they'd be wrong. And the reason for that, and I think you need to listen to the reason for that. The reason for that is that the verse is in the present tense. In Surah Taha, chapter 20, you've got the same verse whereby Pharaoh imposes the same penalty. He's going to execute people. He's going to crucify them or cut their hands. But if you look at the context in which Pharaoh speaks, it's in the future tense. Now, here it is in the present tense. Yuqattalu does not mean to kill you. It means grammatically, you are being slain in great numbers. You are being executed in great numbers. You are being crucified in great numbers. So it's more specifically a declaration of the fact that people who are engaging in this form of sanguinary warfare are bringing it upon themselves. And I think Assad...
Yusuf, would the tasfir of Surah 533 agree with my interpretation or your interpretation of Surah 533?
Well, again, that depends. You see, don't be selective in terms of when you choose tafsir. If you want to choose, there's a multiplicity of tafsir. There's Ibn Kathir, there's Zamakhshari, there's Fakhruddin. Fakhruddin Razi, for example, would Fakhruddin Razi would, for example, agree with the interpretation.
I just simply asked, though, does the tafsir agree with me or does it agree with you according to Surah 533?
No, the commentary, you have a multiplicity of commentaries. Some commentaries may possibly agree with the idea that this is a legal injunction. There are other commentaries that would argue that this particular verse is effectively in the present.
So since you've admitted that there is tafsir, there is scholars that do agree that Surah 533 agrees.
Are you familiar with the tafsir of Razi?
Is this a sign of peaceful? Would you be able to qualify Surah 533 in the light that those Muslims and the Tasfir quote it in agreeing with me as an illegal system to allow people to live in peace? Would you think that's peaceful?
I don't think you listened to what I basically pointed out. I said that some tafsir would view Surah 5 verse 33 as a legal injunction and other tafsir would not. And I gave you one tafsir, which is a tafsir of Razi, that does not see it as a legal injunction. So the point is, for you to now play this any, mini, minor, mo game, it just simply doesn't appear. It's not a question of agreeing with you or agreeing with me or who is right or who is wrong. It's what the actual verse says. And I basically pointed out that this verse is in the present tense. There are tafsirs and even modern commentators who would argue that this verse is not a legal injunction. And you need to respect that. And they argue the point and they make a cogent case on the basis of the Arabic grammar. And then the other commentators would argue that this basically refers to highway robbers and dasswood. So the point is that you've got two mutually exclusive views. And now you choose out of your own agenda to adopt one view which basically suits your own particular evangelical paradigm because it probably gives you the indication that this book is violent or is promoting violence. The point is that here you have a situation, which I've just explained to you, that the Arabic text itself gives the indication that it is in the present tense. You have classical commentators that agree with the fact that this verse is in the present tense, it's not in the future tense. And then you've got other commentators that may suggest it's a legal injunction. Why not basically allow the commentators and the text of the Quran to speak for itself? Why play this game? Why play this game to say, am I right or you right?
That's what I was doing, though, is I was quoting those commentators and I was quoting those tasfir that do actually agree.
What about the
you were giving your own interpretation.
Why don't you accept what Fakhruddin Razi? Why don't you look at some of the commentary of or the
I don't want this to go on. I don't want this to go on too much longer. But if we can see that there's two separate views, as you've already shown within this verse alone, how could you say that the Quran is clear revelation? Because doesn't the Quran say that it is clear revelation?
Well,
and if it's clear revelation, why is there so much turmoil within just one singular verse?
Well, that's an interesting point you raise. Why is it clear revelation? When you have two mutually exclusive views, I think it behoves an outside and objective observer to basically analyze which view seems to be more sound and which view seems to be more appropriate.
So an outside observer can give an absolute?
Sorry, we can't speak over each other. If you want to say something, you say it, then we can reply. We can't speak over each other. So, for example, if I were to have two mutually exclusive views, if somebody would argue that this particular view is a legal injunction, and another individual argues that this is not a legal injunction based on the Arabic grammar and the text itself, then I'll be more inclined to rely upon one that basically looks at the contextual interpretation of that particular verse. And so if something is in the present tense, why would I rely upon a commentary that may choose to adopt and use it as a legal injunction? It's a very dishonest approach to adopt. I mean, like, for example, Numbers 31 verse 17, kill all the boys and kill all the girls, but keep alive for yourself all the girls that have not had sex. Now, how does a soldier in the field verify whether a woman is a virgin or not? How does a soldier in the field verify whether a girl has sex or not? How would you, what kind of interpretive mechanism would you apply to that? I've heard all the
Isn't this cherry picking though that you said that you were against earlier?
Why should I accept one and reject the other? Can you see that you need to have, as a Christian asking me this question, you seem to be having a very inconsistent double standard and double approach in terms of the means you're adopting. You seem to be choosing and inclining towards those interpretations or those interpretive frameworks which seem to give an inclination towards violence as opposed towards peace. And when I presented to you sound, logical argumentation here, which shows and illustrates that this is not a legal injunction, yet you simply choose to ignore that and try and play this game to say, well, you're right. The vast majority of people see this as a legal injunction, and accordingly, my view has to be rejected. I'm saying that view is not accurate based upon the Arabic text itself. And I mean, if one has to apply that, for example, the Amalekite massacre, 1 Samuel 15 verse 3, how would you apply that? How, as a Christian, how could you even dare to even question?
Are we going to keep just cherry picking out of the Bible, or
but I mean,
you against that earlier in your
but hang on a second. You would argue that those people were under judgment of God, even the donkeys, children who were slain. I mean, it does say that. You would argue that they were under judgment of God for what happened.
But weren't you against cherry picking earlier in your presentation? Didn't you condemn it?
Well, I condemn cherry picking.
Then why are you doing it now then with the Bible when you condemned it
when
earlier
I question as to whether the Amalekite massacre is a moral atrocity.
But then you also talked about double standards.
How do I cherry pick? How is it cherry picking? When I'm asking a question, a reasonable question, I'm not quoting that. I'm saying, was the Amalekite massacre a moral atrocity? How is that cherry picking? How is that the same as what you just simply did to Surah 5 verse 33? You, for example, accept that people were killed. You accept that babies were killed. You may have an explanation for that, and I'm willing to hear that, but I'm not cherry picking. There were donkeys that were killed.
You actually agreed that there's tafsir that agree with what I said, though, about Surah 533.
I disagree.
Therefore, I wasn't cherry picking, though, was I, sir?
No, you cherry picked in the sense that you basically chose to exclude an interpretation that did not suit your particular framework, and that went.
I don't want to use all your time, though, sir. I know there's people probably waiting. I do thank you very much, though, for having your interaction with me. Thank you very much, Jonathan. God bless everybody in the room.
Thank you very much.
And it was an excellent time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. We have a couple questions submitted by Hitun. Let me raise those. She says, sir, would you say all the verses we read in Dabiq are not from the Quran?
I've never heard of. In fact, I think Dabiq, if I'm not mistaken, is a magazine.
Yeah.
It's produced by the Clarion Institute, and in fact, I haven't in fact had access to Dabiq as such. I think I may have come across it once or twice on the internet. I'm not so sure if it's even produced by ISIS itself. It seems to be a very glossy presentation. You know, the question again, it's a self-defeating question, Bahatun, because. You know, I could quote, for example, in Dabiq, if it's there, and I don't know if it is there, but you can have Surah 9 verse 5, slay the polytheists wherever you find them, and lie in wait for them and besiege them. And so you may have some crazy character from ISIS wanting to justify that particular position, or you may have someone, for example, quoting Surah 9, 2 verse 190, fight the unbelievers. I mean, the point is that, again, I don't know if Hatun was listening to everything that I said, but I mean, you can basically make out a case for violence out of any religious book that you basically see. And so certainly, I mean, it's a self-defeating question. If Dabiq quotes something, if Robert Spencer quotes something, if, what's this guy, Pamela Geller quotes something, I mean, you know, you can quote anything and everything to basically justify violence. But the question is, are they quoting it in its entirety? Are they engaging in the intertextual and contextual interpretation of the Quranic text, or the biblical text for that matter? And just to point out to Chris, I never atomized anything on scripture. When I made reference to the Amalekite massacre, that's exactly what it says, and that's exactly what you believe in. The context would be, you would say that that was a justifiable slaughter based on what was done by the Amalekites some 400 years before. That's the only difference. But in my case, in Surah 5 verse 33, you have a clear indication that that verse may not be a legal injunction. And the argument presented for that is a very sound, reasonable, and sustainable argument, and I can't see why anyone would reject that.
Okay. We have another question. She asks, Sir, Tafsir for Surah 533 is disagreeing with you. Would you suggest that I take your interpretation or follow the Tafsir?
Yeah, yeah. Again, and this is the point that I was debating with well, I was discussing with I think your previous gentleman. I think his name is Chris. Is that yes? There is a hadith which speaks about the people from the tribe of Uraina or Ukal that came, and these individuals had effectively engaged in robbery, and they basically were given. Firstly, they were given cow's milk and I'm sorry, camel's milk, and they were given a place to stay, and they were given nutrition. And subsequently, they killed the shepherd, they killed the keeper of the camels, and then they were subsequently effectively put to death. And so many people would effectively refer to this as a basis in terms of which Surah 5 verse 33 basically implies. But it's important that the commentaries focus on robbery, they focus on murder, and they focus on rape. That these dahshuds engaged in that. They engage in highway robbery, they engage in murder, and they engage in rape. So a country like Saudi Arabia would, for example, implement this. They would justify this on the basis that somebody would be probably engaging in robbery, or somebody would be engaging in murder or rape, and so they would implement this particular penalty. And yes, that's an interpretation, but that's my point. I said that Assad, and many commentators argue that how can it be a legal injunction if the verse is in the present tense, if it describes a situation, if execution is not just simply execution, but execution in great numbers? How do you execute people in great numbers? How can that be a legal injunction? That's more a commentary, if you like, of the existing social order in this primitive 6th century Arabia, where there was all sorts of sanguinary warfare occurring. So that would be my answer to Hutton on that point. And I think we've kind of explored on that particular issue. But again, the other position would be, Jonathan, is that those who say it's a legal injunction would say it's applicable to murder, robbery, and rape, and so they would apply it accordingly. But I would disagree with that interpretation.
Okay. We had a hand raised from Mark. Let me bring up Mark. Mark, you're live. Go ahead.
Hello, Mark.
Are you still there, Mark? Okay.
I got it. I had to unmute.
Oh, okay. Go.
Hey, Yusuf, I'm sorry.
Hi there.
Hey, first of all, let me thank you for your emphasis on peace. And also, I agree with you on the importance of studying the Bible exegetically and the Quran, any text, any sacred text. So let me just share a couple of ideas and then see where the Quran goes. As I understand the discussion that we're having, it's does the Quran promote peace or aggressive violence, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's one or the other. Either it's a book of peace or a book of violence.
Well, aggressive violence is a qualifying. Yeah.
Okay. As I study the Old Testament, I find a book that does have aggressive violence, and it was pretty much set out. God set it out in Genesis 15 and 17 to say to Abraham that he was going to give him the land of Canaan, and that it would be from the river of Egypt to the river of Euphrates. So there were borders. There was a sense of the size of the property that God was going to give to Abraham's seed. So we see violence within that context. In other words, there was boundaries to the violence. And there were all the other stipulations that we understand through the Old Testament, both through the law, through the prophets. Would you agree with that?
Well, yes and no. I would agree with the fact that the violence was very much geographically located. But the problem which we would have is not so much about the fact that people would argue that it's geographically located. It's a question of the morality of that violence. For example, I gave the classic example of Numbers 31 verse 17. Numbers 31, and this is something which I raised recently in the debate, speaks about the Midianites. Now again, that's a geographically located community. And the story goes is that they warred against the Midianites, that's the children of Israel. and the Lord commanded Moses, and they slew all the males, that's the fighting warriors, and they slew the kings of Midian besides the rest of them. So I would agree with the fact that in that instance, and in many other instances, wars of Joshua, wars of Moses, violence is very much geographically located and geographically limited. But the problem lies is that when you look at sometimes the nature of the violence, which is in many instances under the justification and authority of God. To give you a classic example, Numbers 31:17, after the destruction of the Midianites, maybe we can engage with this. Moses, after destroying the Midianites and taking the women and the children captives, in verse 15, Moses asks a question, have you saved all the women alive? That's a question he asks. And then he goes on to say that these are those that commit trespass of the Lord in the matter of Peor, and there was a plague. And then he gives a commandment. Now, therefore, kill every male among the little ones, that's the boys, and kill every woman that hath known man by lying with him, but all the women children that have not known a man by lying with him keep alive for yourselves. Now, the point is, euphemistically speaking, there's a destruction of the Midianites, the fighting men are killed, the kings are slain, and after that, if you look at the morality of the entire event, and this is a point, because Moses in the Qur'an is a peaceful individual, but in the Old Testament, he asks the question, have all the women, have you been kept alive? You kill all the boys, and you kill the girls that have had sex with men. But the girls that have not had sex with men, you keep alive for yourself. Now, again, it's not cherry picking, because that's actually what the verse says. So the question we ask is, Mark, how does the soldier in the field determine whether a woman has had sex or not? And then further on in the passage, it says that they amassed 30 and 2,000 women that have not known man by lying with him. Now, how do the soldiers in this primitive age make that determination? And how were they captured? And these are young girls. So I accept the fact that, you quoted Genesis and you spoke about the seed of Abraham and being given and I might add that that's an unfulfilled prophecy, by the way, but that's another debate. But even though the argument, the violence is geographically located, you find effectively that the morality in this violence is questioned. And the question at the end of the day is, would God inspire his prophets with commands to commit this particular level of violence? I mean, what do sucklings do? Because they're going to be future generations that are going to commit murder. That's what William Lane Craig argues, that they're going to commit disbelief. Donkeys, children, and passages which become problematic. Now, we don't have something like that in the Quran, and we don't have something which promotes universal violence, or at least violence on the level that you see where men, women, children, suckling are all killed. Now, the question is that if a Christian would justify that, and he's got the right to justify that by saying that these are geographically located and they may be historically specific and they were under the judgment of God, then how could one raise inconsistently a critique against the Quran by suggesting that that is a violent book and therefore this book promotes violence? It's a very inconsistent standard. And I would argue that this also not just is in the Old Testament, it flows to the New Testament, because you believe literally that when Jesus comes, he will slay his enemies will be his footstool, he will massacre his enemies, he will come like with a rod of iron, with a sword sticking out of his mouth. That's all in the book of Revelation, and many people interpret this literally, you may not. And so you see that violence is very much, the violence in the Old Testament, effectively, that eternal, that judgment that you see through these geographical communities is eternalized when Jesus comes back on his return. And so you see this paradigm. It's not a shift from violent to peace, it's a shift from violent, some peace, and then violence in the end.
Well, Yusuf, you changed the subject. I thought the subject was talking about the Quran. Maybe
well, you asked me about the Bible. You brought up the issue of the Bible.
I simply asked you the question, do you agree that the Jews were given by God in Genesis boundaries to the violence? But, in other words, boundaries to the
Can you give me the passage? Can you give me the Genesis?
Yes, Genesis 15. Hang on just a second, I'll give you specifics. Genesis 15. And let me find the verse. Also Genesis 17.
Verse 8.
I
will give unto thee and the land and the seed, the land wherein thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. Would that be a far more accurate example?
I was going to quote from verse 18. In that day, Hassim made a covenant with Abraham, saying, "Unto thy seed have I given this land from the river of Egypt unto the great river, the river Euphrates." And then then over in chapter 17, let me find the verse there.
17 verse 8.
I'm
17
sorry?
Verse 8. It's 17 verse 8. I will give unto thee,
Yes.
and I seed after thee, the land wherein thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I'll be their God. Am I correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
Wow.
Now that would be an unfulfilled prophecy. If you look at Deuteronomy chapter 18 verses 20, it says, Deuteronomy chapter 18 verses 19. I'm sorry, but the prophet. Let me just try and get the verse here. If thou say in thy heart, how shall we know the word which the Lord had spoken? When a prophet speaketh in the name of the Lord, if the thing follow not, nor come to pass, that is a thing which the Lord has not spoken, but the prophet has spoken it presumptuously, thou shalt not be afraid of him. Now, if you apply that test to Genesis chapter 17, verse 8, as an example, which I've got, I know the other reference, I'll give unto thee and thy seed after thee all the land when thou art a stranger, all the land of Canaan. That's a promise to Abraham, right? Now, if you look at, if you tie that up with Deuteronomy 18, and we need to ask, is this a fulfilled prophecy or is this an unfulfilled prophecy? Well, Acts 7 verse 5 points out, if you look at Acts 7:5, Stephen's defense, and he, that is God, gave him, Abraham, none inheritance in it, no, not so much as to set his foot upon. Yet he promised that he would give it to him for a possession and to his seed after his, when as yet he had no child. Now, the point is, at the end of the day, that automatically, you look at what Acts 7 verse 5 states, then the prophecy in Genesis chapter 17 verse 8 and the other chapter has been automatically invalidated, because you have a situation where God promises Abraham land, and in Acts 7:5 you have a situation, and in Genesis, for example, Abraham died and his sons died, not having seen the land which God had promised. So effectively, this can be argued that it's an unfulfilled prophecy.
All right, Yusuf, excuse me. We're getting so far off topic. Let me see if I can move more quickly.
Well, I think let's deal with the topic. We're dealing with the Holy Bible. The topic is, does the Quran promote peace or violence or aggressive violence? Let's focus on that. And then I think you asked me these questions, and so it behoves me to deal with them in the best manner that I could, and that's why I responded.
All right, let me see if I can move through the question more, because I do have a question. First of all, I view, even though we disagree, I view, based on Genesis and other verses throughout the Old Testament, that God gave the Jews land, property. He actually marked it off. When you come to the New Testament, you have Jesus bringing his peace, offering his peace, giving his peace, and he tells his disciples to take that message of peace around the world. Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and every corner of the planet. And as you pointed out in Revelation, we do see at the end of time, we do see violence, but prior to that time, Christianity doesn't, according to Christ and the apostles, there's not a call for violence.
Well, just on that point, I mean, you know what? Well, I accept that in principle what you're saying. Although there are certain passages in the Gospels where Jesus tells his disciples to get a Makai. You know, Makai means a sword, particularly when he goes to the Garden of Gethsemane. But that's another point. The issue is that your idea of Jesus, or Christian fundamentalist notions of Christ, is that he will come back, he will fight against those who reject him. In fact, in Revelation 16:2, repent or I will come unto thee quickly and will fight against them with the sword of my mouth. The Son of God, who has eyes like unto a flame of fire and his feet are like brass, behold, I will kill her children with death. And the churches shall know that I am he which searches his reins and hearts, and I will give unto every one of you according to your works. I will come with a sharp sword with two edges. Now, basically, some have argued this would mean Jesus would come back with his arm to the teeth, in a manner of speaking. But the point is that, whether you argue that Jesus in the first century is peaceful, we as a Muslim, I accept that he's peaceful. I accept all the prophets of God are peaceful. But the notion of Christ in end times is very much of a violent individual. And you believe that he will come and destroy the rest of humanity. or those who are predominantly not Christians according to your definition, and he will come with violence and he will slay. That's why some have argued in Luke 19:27, those enemies of mine who will not let me rule over them, bring them here and slaughter them before me. Some have viewed that as a kind of an allusion to an end time prophecy when he comes back on his return, even though people would argue that Luke 19 is a parable. The point is that the notion of Christ that you have in the New Testament is someone that effectively will come back and will perform acts of violence. So how can you call him Prince of Peace when in his primary original form, according to your belief, he's going to come and massacre people that do not believe in him? And unless, of course, I see some Christians interpret this metaphorically, but there are many Christians that literally believe this. They literally believe Jesus will kill children with death. The churches shall know that I am he which searches the rein. And they'd argue, well, he's God. He's entitled to kill. He's entitled to destroy and massacre. So I'm saying, you know, when we play this game about peace and violence, I'm prepared to accept the fact that the New Testament primarily presents Jesus as fundamentally peaceful. However, he does engage in violent actions. He, for example, whoops, the moneylenders in the temple. He, for example, tells his disciples to get swords on his defense in the upper room when he's about to go to the Garden of Gethsemane. He speaks in violent terms. You know, although think not that I'm come to bring peace, I come to bring a sword. I'm come to set a man at variance against the father and the mother against the son. Now, obviously, you'll interpret that and say, well, people who accept Christ automatically will be in hostility with their own family members and so on. But I accept Jesus is peaceful. I accept all prophets of God are primarily peaceful. Certainly, parts of the New Testament present Jesus as a man of peace, but there are other aspects in the New Testament which present him as a very violent individual that will kill and massacre. And you have to accept that. You have to accept that.
I'd like to get back to the Quran. That's where I've been trying to go for the last 20 minutes. In the Quran has many, many verses that that present violence, and you have said that we have to take a look at it in context.
Yeah.
Take a look at it exegetically. So when you take a look at all the verses and what they mean in the context of the Quran, are you saying that there can be no understanding of there being violence against Christians and Jews who do not become Muslims?
Absolutely not. In fact, you'll only come to that interpretation if you would atomize that text. And I would argue the same way for the Bible. I'll give you the room of interpretation for you to exegete passages of violence, and I would argue and urge you to do the same here. Only if you atomize passages and verses in the Quran can you basically justify or make out a case for inherent violence towards other people. There's always a background. The one verse which didn't have a context, which I provided, but which is universally accepted as being historically specific, is Surah 9, verse 29, which we discussed earlier on. But generally speaking, the overarching trend is when people fight against you, you fight against them. When the hostilities cease, then you are to cease from the hostilities. But no way is there a promotion of violence to the extent that it basically allows the enforcement or the imposition of one's faith on the other. Because strategically and logistically, it would mean creating a nation and society of hypocrites, and these people would eventually turn. People who lie about their faith cannot basically live their faith, and so subsequent generations will see through this, and the whole faith will basically fall into pieces. And so logistically, the old age fallacy promoted by Orientalists that Islam was spread by the sword is probably one of the most historically known myths, or the known myths that historians have basically ever repeated. And so I don't see how one can even come to the understanding that there's violence against non-Muslims or people of the book. So
when I'm going through the Quran, and I do not speak or read Arabic, so I have to read it in English. But when I look through several different translations of the English translations of the Quran, anytime that I come to, whether it's Quran, Surah 25, 33, 47, 48, 61, 66, 9, 8, 7, 2, 4, any time that I come to any verse about violence against disbelievers, in the context, there's never once a meaning or an understanding or a clear interpretation that that means violence against Christians and Jews just because they will not become Muslims.
No. I don't. Have you listened to the entire presentation? I'm not so sure if you came in quite late, but I did spend some time, an inordinate amount of time, for about an hour, 15 minutes, bringing up the kind of key verses. And 25:33. Those are a bit vague and arbitrary, but I mean some of the key verses were Surah 9 verse 5, Surah 9 verse 29, Surah 47 verse 4. The kind of key verses which are used to generally promote the idea that the Quran promotes violence. I went through them, and I think I did a fairly decent presentation, for example, on Surah 9, which is the verse on the sword, the main verse that everybody promotes, and in fact showed that in fact is a calling to peace. In fact, it's the complete opposite to violence in Surah 9 verse 5. So there may be other verses you may obviously choose to quote and bring upon and so on, and of course we can deal with that, but it's always important not to read the verse in isolation. If you read the verse in isolation, there's a possibility you're going to come to an act of violence. And always bear in mind that there is also an overarching verse in the Quran, Surah 2 verse 190, which is applicable to every other verse on violence, which says, fight those who commit aggression against you, but you do not transgress, you do not commit acts of aggression. Fight those who fight against you. So it is in the context of a defensive warfare that basically exists. And a person who stubbornly or refuses to wanting to see that, I mean, is simply out to sustain a prejudice or stereotype that he has in his mind, and it's difficult for him to get out of that. And so therefore I'd appeal to you is don't engage in an atomistic. If you engage in an atomistic interpretation of the Quran or the Bible, you can come to any conclusion you want to, and I would agree with you on that point. But if you read it holistically and juxtapose it with the other verses and read it in its context, then it would effectively promote universal peace.
All right, well, thank you very much. I was with you from the beginning, and it's because of what you said earlier that I wanted to ask you these questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. I appreciate the engagement. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Next up is Robert. Let's bring up Robert. Robert, you're live. Go ahead.
All right, great. Okay, so thanks for taking this. I just basically have a simple question after hearing your interaction with Chris and others. So if I understand you correctly, there are many interpretations of Islam, of the Sharia law, the fiqh, and the high punishments, etc. So can you say with absolute certainty that your interpretation or the interpretation of the scholars that you actually asked us to read and quote, so on and so forth, that you appeal to, is the correct understanding of Islam? And more importantly, those that differ, okay, with with your view or the view of the scholars that you are promoting and want us to read and quote, et cetera, those that differ from them, is that the wrong Islam?
Okay, that's a straightforward question, and I see some of the other comments by individuals when you came on. What I pointed out was in relation to the question asked, I think, by Chris, was when he raised the aspect of Sharia, I mentioned the fact that there are multiple interpretations of Sharia, and there's no particular monolithic understanding of what constitutes Sharia. And this is a product of Islamic history and a product of what tragically happened in Islamic history when people incorporated and introduced the idea of taqleed. Certainly you're going to have different interpretations and different methods in terms of approaching scripture. But what I would argue is that if a person were to basically make out a case for violence using the Quran, and if a person were to basically make out a case for peace using the Quran as his primary source, then one would have to obviously analyze who presents a better argumentation, which sounds sustainable and which can effectively be justified. So when you have a situation where somebody comes to you and presents a reasonable, decent explanation that the Quran, at a fundamental level, it does have verses on violence, but at a fundamental level promotes peace. And you have, to corroborate the fact, 1.5 billion people in the world who are Muslims, and the vast majority of them who promote peace or speak about peace. And then you have a minority of individuals who may engage in extreme acts and may sometimes justify the acts, engaging in atomistic interpretation of scripture. Then you need to ask the question, why would you choose to side with those in a minority position and who do not even make out a decent, sensible case in justifying their particular actions? For me, I would argue that if a Christian raises this, not only is it a sign of a failed argument, but it reflects for me an inconsistency and duplicitous double standard on his side, whereby he would choose to stubbornly and nefariously continuously promote the idea that the Quran is a book of violence and that the minority interpretation or the minority actions that you see in the world are more normative of the Islamic worldview as opposed to the majority out there. So again, there are different interpretations, but I might also add this, in Surah 5 verse 33, I gave one example about two mutually different interpretations. Even the other interpretation where people view this as a legal injunction, that too cannot be seen as an act of inherent violence, because even in that context, the perpetrators have to be brought before a probably appointed qadi, a judge. He has to be tried and tested before a proper court of law. His version has to be presented, and then of course judgment has to be passed. So nobody can even if one has to argue, and I was just referring to Surah 5 verse 33 about the two mutually different understandings on that particular verse. Even if one were to accept it as a legal injunction, still one can't use that verse to make out a case for these kind of liars, fairy killings or assassinations or just ad hominem attacks on people. Those who would argue that would also go on to argue that that can only be imposed by a court in a properly duly constructed fashion, and that the individual himself has to be tried and probably tested, and only eventually judgment has to be basically pointed out. So I didn't speak about different interpretations of Islam generally. I spoke about the fact that Surah 5 verse 133 has a different interpretation, a different connotation. But I also add that the vast majority of people out there who are Muslims, who claim to be Muslims, 1.5 billion, if they are peaceful and they believe, and a lot of them believe from the bottom of their heart that Islam promotes peace, and you see an individual that promotes an argument that basically makes out a case for peace, then why would one still choose to go ahead and support those that make out a case of violence? For me, that's a double standard.
I can certainly answer that. The whole premise, the question I asked you remained unanswered. I said, can you specifically say that those that are not practicing, well, your interpretation or the interpretation of the scholars that you appeal to us to, if their practice of it is wrong, okay, if you can't say that, if you can't say that they're wrong, that is
I said
wrong.
they're wrong. I said
no, you didn't. I didn't quite hear that. So you're saying that they are wrong. You didn't
listen. It seems you never listened to what I said. I said clearly, if you see someone like ISIS, for example, representing Islam, they're wrong. They're clearly wrong. If you see people like Boko Haram engaging in acts of violence and purportedly using an interpretive framework of the Quran to promote violence, they are wrong. I have no problem with that. And I speak out this. I've spoken out publicly in Somalia, in Mogadishu. I've spoken out in Uganda. Nobody's done anything to me, and I speak out, and the vast majority of Muslims speak out against this. The problem is that we are not given a voice. It's people like Jonathan, for example, that give alternative opinions. But I mean, the vast majority of media, the media in general, would rather want a version of Islam presented which is inherently violent because it justifies stereotypes. It justifies aggression.
So I just want to be clear here. So then those Muslims who are practicing what ISIS is practicing, that interpretation of Islam
is wrong.
They are mushrikeen. We're not mushrikeen.
Well, again, you failed to mushrikeen.
I'm sorry. They're apostates.
I'm sorry.
They are apostates.
Well, they would be Khawarij. They would be like the Khawarij. If you know the history of the Kharijites in the early Islamic history, these were people who assassinated Ali. These were people who engaged in what we would call takfir, that people who they believed were outside the frame of Islam were not.
So then they're still Muslim. They're still Muslim.
So I would argue yes. I would argue yes.
Okay. So then, according to the Quran, then, okay.
I would argue that these individuals that are engaging in acts of violence, and I'm saying many of them don't even know the Quran. So I don't know where you get this idea that they know the Quran. The statistics show otherwise. I've sent Jonathan an article from The Independent which shows the vast majority of these are scriptural novices. They're religious illiterates.
That's fine, but they're still Muslim.
I have no problem with that. They are apostates.
They are apostates. Okay.
Not only are they apostates, But
that's
they
actually good.
view them as enemies of the Quran, enemies of Islam.
That's good.
And they need to be confronted with. Yeah, I agree with that entirely. I have no problem. I have no fear saying that, and I'll say it publicly to their face if you bring them. But the problem is, you would support them. You see, you support the interpretation. The problem is, people like Robert Spencer, Geller, David Wood, and so on, they would argue that these extremists and fanatics are basically are practicing the correct Islam. So you are in fact in the same camp with them. So I would also have to confront your negative stereotypes and your prejudice at the same time. So I would place you in the same camp as ISIS, because you'd be basically making out the same argumentation that they would, or their leaders would. And so I would have to confront you on that point as well. And
that leads to the point then. Well, that leads to the point then. Let's kind of explore that a little bit if we can. I understand that it is the position. Now, maybe you disagree with this, but this has been practiced throughout Islamic history. Where
no, but it hasn't. It hasn't. It hasn't.
No,
but
hold on. You haven't even heard what I'm asking. You haven't even heard what I'm asking.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. For instance, when a prisoner of war is captured, you mentioned that there are rules about this. The caliph has a few options. Okay, this is according to one of the scholars that you referenced, Imam Shafi, that they can be sold into slavery, they can be executed. The caliph can ransom them or trade them for other prisoners held by the kuffar, or he can simply let them go. Is this true?
No, but it's the only verse which in fact refers to that is in Surah 47 verse 4. Surah 47 verse 4 speaks about a battle having engaged, and when you engage in battle, you smite at the necks. That's a conventional form of warfare in the 6th century.
Okay,
After
so now will be shooting.
Hang on a second. Hang on, you asked the question. After the war lays down its burdens, it says now is a time for ransom. In other words, you ransom those captives of war, or for charity, you let them go free. There's absolutely nothing where you basically simply engage in wholesale and mass execution. It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. There is no Quranic, let me put it this way, there's absolutely no Quranic justification for that flawed comment that you basically made. It's not there. It's non-existent. Surah 47.
Wait. Are you saying to me a prisoner captured in war, okay, the caliph cannot sell him into slavery? Are you saying that's wrong?
Well, if he does sell him into slavery, it would be a total contradiction of Surah 2 verse 177. Because Surah 2 verse...
So Imam Shafi is wrong. So Imam Shafi...
Well, he would be... You must understand something. Imam Shafi would be wrong because Imam Shafi was writing in a time where slavery was existent. And he would be writing in the time when Islam was in its expansionist form, and you had the Fatimid dynasty and the instance of the Mamluks, and you had slavery existing. The Arab slave trade did exist. I don't deny that. I'm not going to apologize for that. I condemn it in the strongest of terms. And so writing in that particular milieu, he's obviously going to develop a jurisprudence which accommodates that and incorporates that. But the point is, you need to now give me a passage. And I pointed out earlier on, you need to give me a passage whereby it states there that this is now the punishment. And Surah 2 verse 177, وَالسَّائِلِينَ وَفِي الرِّقَابِ, it says there classically, openly, liberation of slaves.
Okay.
That cannot be denied.
So you're asking me to provide you a Quranic surah, evidently, that says to do something like this now, today. But when they were doing it back then, that was okay because... No,
I never said that. You see, again, you're providing... Again, you're misquoting what I'm saying. You're misquoting what I'm saying. I presented to you for more than 1 hour and 15 minutes. Topic was, does the Quran promote peace or violence? Not what Imam Shafi says, not what the Hadith says, not what Ibn Ishaq says. Does the Quran say? If you want to discuss all of that, that's effectively a different topic in its entirety. But let me point this out to you. Is that the type of sanguinary warfare and sex slavery that you find in the Old Testament is non-existent in Islam. So Numbers 31:17, which speaks about sex slavery, the soldier determining whether a woman is a virgin or not, and then killing those who are not virgins, that's non-existent in Islam. The fact where children and babies and donkeys are
wait. So when the Quran says permissible are to you, those that your right hand possesses, what does that mean? Oh wait, and better yet, wait, hold on. Forbidden to you are married women except for what your right hand possesses. What does that mean?
Again, sir, you're quoting again what I call the cherry picking. Let's look at Surah 4.
Let's cherry picking now.
Well, let's look at. Don't jump the gun. You pointed out the fact that the Quran says permitted for you are what your right hands possess. Did you say that? You said that, right? Yes. Now let's look at it. Let's look at Surah 4, and I'm opening up to you from verse 22 leading up to that verse. And listen to me and hear me I know you like the sound of your own voice, but hear me out and look at this. Surah 4 verse 22 says, وَلَا تَنْكِحُوا مَا نَكَحَ. Note, and marry. It speaks about marry, not woman whom your fathers married, except what is past. It was shameful and odious and abominable custom. Verse 23, prohibited to you are your mother's, daughters, sisters, fathers. Now, what are they prohibited for? Are they prohibited for sex, or prohibited, as in the context of verse 22, marriage? And then it goes on to verse 24, also prohibited. وَالْمُحْصَنَاتِ مِنَ النِّسَاءِ إِلَّا مَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُكُمْ. Also prohibited a woman already married. Again, what are women married prohibited for? For sex or for marriage? Except whom your right hands possess. Right, so basically, if it's sex, okay, if it's sex, Jonathan, why does Surah 4 verse 25 condemn sex with those whom your right hands possess? Why did it condemn it?
It doesn't condemn it. It doesn't condemn it.
Now listen to Surah 4 verse 25. It says, if any of you have not the means to marry free believing women, then they may marry believing girls amongst those whom their right hands possess. Now think about this, sir. If the Quran now, if Islam allowed basically sex with captives, why would it even so you see, you can't talk over me. If you want to have a debate with me, we'll have a debate and we can engage each other in professional fashion. But I'm basically pointing out to you that why would the Quran contemplate marriage with those whom your right hands possess if it allowed you for free sex? Because it says here, if you have not the means to marry free believing women, then marry girls amongst those whom your right hands possess. And not only that, it says here they should be chaste, not lustful, nor should you take them as paramours. The word in Arabic is muhsanati ghayra musabihati wala muttakhidati akhdan. Now, why would it tell you that you cannot take these people whom your right hands possess as secret love companions, if on the other hand, Surah 4 verse 24, according to your warped interpretation, allowed you to have sex with these captive women?
Can I answer you?
Also, further than that, in Surah Nur,
Can I answer you?
So let me finish this point, then you can comment. Okay. In Surah Nur verse 32, it says you may marry believing men and women amongst those whom you capture and amongst slaves. Now, why would the Quran, in fact, contemplate marriage with slaves and marriage with those whom your right hands possess if it already allowed you to have sex with them without marriage? Why would it even contemplate in the first place? So the question that you're basically asking is incorrect. Yes, there was a belief. There was a belief subsequently in Islam that people had the right to basically have concubines. And again, this comes from the Judeo-Christian tradition, because in Judeo-Christianity, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, you could have sex slaves and you could have concubines. So for example, Keturah was a concubine of Abraham. Hagar was a concubine of Abraham. These were women in bondage. And so they were not lawfully married to them. And so accordingly, they had sex. So don't superimpose a Judeo-Christian interpretation on the Quran. I would argue, what about Solomon? Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines.
Ask me a question. Wait. This is about the Bible.
What were the concubines?
Can I answer your question? Can I answer your question, please? You said, why would the Quran tell you that you can marry believing slave women? Because you're believing slave women. It doesn't say anything about kufar slave women. It says,
well, the point is that
yes, but the unbelieving slave women, you can have sex with them. That is clear.
Robert, listen to this. Listen to this. Why don't you disengage, Robert, in the cherry picking? I gave you a rule that when you read the Quran,
cherry pick.
Let me finish the point.
So everybody cherry picks now.
Robert, you just proved my case by cherry picking, Robert, because you quoted Surah 4 verse 24, which says permitted for you for sex. It doesn't say sex. There's nothing about sex. Verse 22 speaks about the prohibited categories for marriage. Robert, have you got a Quran there? Have you got a Quran?
Wait. Why does it say permitted to you are your wives?
It seems you're not a man of reason and you're not someone that can argue appropriately. That's why you want to talk over me. If you want to talk over me, we can have a debate. And I challenge you to a debate if you in South Africa like to come to state.
Permitted to you are your wives and what your right hand possesses.
Yeah, but for marriage, Robert. Robert,
what your right hand possesses.
Robert, it says the prohibition is for marriage, not for sex, because verse 22
you're forbidden to marry your own wife? Is that what you're saying?
Prohibited for marriage are married women. In other words, you cannot marry another woman that's married. Robert,
I've been looking forward to this for a while. Do better.
Listen to me, Robert. Listen again. You're doing what we would call the cherry picking fallacy, and it seems to me that you proved my case what I've done the entire time. I started off by saying, don't engage. Let me finish the point, then you can talk. I started by saying, don't cherry pick, don't atomize. And then you brought up Surah 4 verse 24. I said the Surah 4 verse 24 referred to prohibition for sex, and I provided that absolutely not, because Surah 4 starts from verse 22. It speaks about the prohibited categories for marriage. Now, in Surah 4 verse 24, there's a prohibited category from you marrying a woman who is already married, because you cannot marry. Polyandry is prohibited. And so at this particular point in time, since polyandry is prohibited, it, however, allows you to marry a woman amongst your captives, or those whom your right hands possess, because Surah 4 verse 22 speaks about marrying not women whom your fathers married. Then verse 23 also says, prohibited for you. It doesn't mention marriage. Marriage is in parentheses, but it's prohibited for you are your mother's daughters, sisters, fathers, sisters. It's not speaking about prohibition for sex. It's speaking about prohibition for marriage. Now, the fact that marriage doesn't appear, for example, in verse 23, doesn't mean that the prohibition is in respect of sex. It's in respect of marriage. And then it goes on, verse 24, polyandry is prohibited. You are not allowed to marry a woman who's already married, except you can marry those whom your right hands possess. Verse 25 says, you cannot take them as paramours, as concubines. So the argument that you basically presented is a self-defeating one. Why would the Quran on the one hand say that you are to marry those whom your right hands possess? You cannot basically take them as paramours or concubines. And then it tells you in Surah Nur verse 32, marry amongst the slaves, male or female. Why would it even contemplate marriage when sex would be allowed? And why is there no explicit mention of sex here? It's basically marriage. Surah 4 speaking about the prohibition in respect of the categories of people you cannot marry. You cannot marry your father. You cannot marry your mother. You cannot marry your sister. You cannot marry daughter. You cannot marry a woman who are already married. You are allowed to marry those amongst the captives. So can you see, again, what you've done is you've distorted and you've basically proved my case. This is a reason why there's so much conflict and turmoil, is because of people like you.
Okay, yeah, I'm to blame. Okay, so why does it say permissible, okay, are your wives and what your right hand possesses? What are they permissible for? If you already have your wives, don't tell me it's about marriage when that it's permissible to marry your own wife. That doesn't make sense.
No, but Robert, again, Robert, listen to me. It's not speaking about permissibility here. It's speaking about prohibition. You're failing again. You're failing dismally in the topic.
No, there are two verses I mentioned. Unbelievable. Two verses I mentioned. I mentioned one verse where it tells you what is permissible, and another verse that tells you what is forbidden. The one that says what is forbidden is everything.
No. I think Robert, again, you must.
Well, listen. Let me read it to you. And if you fear that this is 4:3, and if you fear that
chapter 4, verse 22,
marry those that please you or other women, 2, 3, or 4. But if you fear that you will not be just, then marry only 1 or 3 of what your right hand possesses.
Yeah, so that's the point. If you look at Surah 4 verse 3, where does it say sex? Where does it say again having sex? Again, it's speaking about the permissibility of marriage. So let's look at Surah 4 verse 33. You see again,
unbelievable.
This is how your argument is so self-defeating. I already.
All right. So
no, but I think I need to clarify this
point
because
it's permissible
you're going around in circles and you're not presenting a formal, decent argumentation here. I think that's the problem. You're in denial totally. Okay. I mean, Surah 4 verse 24. Let me just finish on this point. Surah 4 verse 24 speaks about prohibited degrees of marriage. Surah 4 verse 3 speaks about the permissibility of marriage. And so it says here, you cannot marry the orphans, then marry a woman of your choice, 2 or 3 or 4. But if you fear that you will not be able to deal justly with them, then only 1, or what your right hands possess. So basically, again, that's a case of permissibility for marriage. So the argument you presented again is totally self-defeating and totally against the point. And this just proves my case. What people do all the time, Robert, is that don't cherry pick to suit your own whims. Don't promote the atomistic. If you want to promote the gospel, then this is a bad way to do it. That's my point. You don't promote the gospel by presenting falsehood against another person's religion. If you believe Islam is false, that's your belief, but you don't promote manufactured falsehood against somebody else's faith just so that you can promote the gospel. That's a very bad way.
All right. So, okay. So it's permissible to marry your own wives and marry believing women. But, okay.
But it doesn't say about marrying your own wives. Again, you're going around in circles. It speaks about prohibiting marrying women who are married, except those whom your right hand speaks. All right. Well, you're not seeing it, Robert. You're being stubborn and not seeing it. I don't know if I should remove the wool behind your eyes, but certainly it seems to me it's a very poor level of scholarship on your part, or at least what you read from the internet, that is.
Okay, let's move on. Hatun asks in the Q&A box, she says, can you kindly explain to us what is the difference between nikah and marriage?
I'm sorry, I didn't get that, Robert. Jonathan?
She says, what's the difference between nikah and marriage?
Okay, nikah basically, the word nakaha can have two meanings. It can mean the actual contraction of marriage, basically, which is where you formally engage into a contract with a woman to marry. It can also mean the actual consummation of the marriage itself. So it can mean multiple. It's multiple meanings, but the choice of meaning that you would choose to use would be again defined by the context that that would be surrounding the sentence that is read. So generally speaking, the conventional understanding of nakaha or nikah would mean the coming together or the joining together of two parties in a formal kind of union in order to regulate basically a relationship with them, and this basically has conditions and rules, and so a conventional definition would be marriage itself. Marriage would be would be an appropriate definition.
Okay, we had a hand raised from Vladimir. Vladimir, you're live. Go ahead.
Thank you. So, Yusuf, thank you for your conversation.
Thank you,
for
Vladimir.
your presentation of your arguments we've engaged before in this webinar on the deity of Christ and some other topics. So, tonight I would like to challenge some of the history you've presented, namely at Tabuk, Battle of Mu'tah, and things like that. So, let's start with Tabuk. Do you actually think that the Byzantines assembled an army actually did that, to which Muhammad had to respond?
Is that the question?
Yes, that's one of the questions.
Well, okay. According to, and again, this is what is contained. Well, what we have received in the historical material, some of it is questionable, or some of it is not. If you look at Ibn Sa'd in his book called the Kitab al-Tabaqat al-Kabir, he writes, and I quote from the following. It says, the narrator Saud, it reportedly reached the Messenger of Allah that the Romans had concentrated large forces in Syria, and that Heraclius had disbursed 1 year's salary to his soldiers, and the tribes of Laqam, Judham, Amila, and Ghassan had joined hands with him. They had sent their vanguards to Al-Balqa. The messenger of God summoned the people to march. He set out and informed them about the place which he intended, so they could make necessary preparations. And he sent messengers to Mecca and to the tribes of Arabia to send help. This took place in the days of intense heat. So what you see here basically is clear indication, at least, according to the, and I'm not saying that these particular sources are 100% accurate, but from what we can gather, we can see clearly that it was the Byzantines who effectively started this war. And what does one in fact expect the Prophet to do? Is he to sit back and do nothing while Muslim lives will basically get slaughtered? Or basically do what is correct, that is assemble the actual Muslim community, go out and fight against the aggressors. And that's exactly what he did. But the point is that there was no aggression on the part of the Muslim community, historically speaking at the very least, to go and attack the Romans or the Byzantines just because they were Christians. Because if that was the case, then nothing prevented them from going to Tabuk and then marching all the way to Rome, for that matter, or the East Roman Empire. I believe the headquarters may have been in Iznik, subject to correction. Nothing prevented them from doing it. But once they came to Tabuk, they saw nothing, no hostilities, and then they effectively turned back. You can go on further.
So Yusuf, the Western Roman Empire was long dissolved.
This is the Eastern Roman Empire.
You're speaking about Rome. Rome wasn't their capital.
There were two Roman empires. There was the conventional Western Roman Empire. They were destroyed by the Goths and the Gallic invasions that happened in the 1st and the 2nd century. But there was still a powerful East Roman Empire that existed right up until the 6th century. And the Emperor Heraclius did in fact exist. He's a historical figure, and he was described generically as Caesar. So I think the existence of the Byzantines, it's not in dispute at all.
Of course it isn't. That is what you were saying is that what would stop them from marching to Rome. What I was pointing out is that Rome wasn't their capital, rather Constantinople. Regardless,
Constantinople. But there was a depleted form of the empire that existed in Rome at that time. But you're correct, Constantinople. Nothing prevented them, which would have been much more closer to Arabia than Rome. But what we see from the following is that the impending invasion by the Ghassanids, who were part and parcel of the Byzantine Empire, because we have one narration in Sahih Muslim and again, it's one of the sources. It says
Okay,
that
Yusuf.
Umar, for example, had a companion from the Ansar, and they had a discussion that the Ghassanids, who were part of the Byzantine Empire, were shoeing the horses in order to attack us. And then one companion attended the apostle and then
Ghassanids
came to
were
him at night
actually
and
a
knocked. And then he said, "Have
vassal
the
client
Ghassanids come."
state of the
So
Byzantines.
there was a discussion
They were,
to basically confront this force that came through.
and the Ghassanids weren't a part of a Roman Empire; they were a vassal force of the Roman Empire. Regardless,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
the thing is, you state that according to your Muslim sources, the Byzantines actually assembled an army in order to invade Rashidun Caliphate. That's not true. Actually, what we have, according to what you read, is Muhammad acting up on a rumor that Byzantines actually wanted to invade. So notice this. Following the rumors of Byzantine invasion, the Muslims, as well as allies of Muhammad, received an urgent call to join the campaign. But the Arabs of the desert showed little interest. Many came up with excuses not to participate. Muhammad provided incentives to persuade the Arabs to join and provided many gifts. So Muhammad and his forces marched northwards towards Tabuk in October of 630. After arriving at Tabuk and camping there, the Muhammad's army prepared to face the Byzantine invasion. Muhammad spent 10 days at Tabuk, scouting the area, making alliances with local chiefs, and with no sign of the Byzantine army, he returned to Medina. So what do we see from this? Byzantines, after their war with the Persians in 628, when it ended, they had absolutely no intentions of attacking the Rashidun Caliphate. That is absolutely nonsensical. What we see is that Muhammad, as a great strategist he was acting upon rumors and assembling his Medinan army to go and scout for the Byzantines when they were not actually there. His people could provide him with intel from the Ghassanids and from the Byzantine armies. And yet he listened to a rumor and went up to Tabuk. So
let's play the devil's advocate and assume for a second that is a rumor. And this again, I see someone says, Vladik, stop reading Shamoun propaganda. Well, I don't want to comment on that. But you
no, this is not from Sam Shamoun. This is actually
whatever the case. Let's leave that out of the hand. What you fail to understand is that when I mentioned earlier on, there were two issues, right? The aspect of the so-called rumor or threat which you stated, which he acted upon, was preceded by another incident where I pointed out that the ambassador, there was an ambassador called Al-Harith ibn Al-Azdi. He was basically going to dispatch a message from the Prophet to the ruler of Basra. And then what basically happened is that this ambassador was captured and he was tied up and he was effectively executed. Now, in the 6th century, there's no internet telecommunications. This was viewed as an act of war. So if there are subsequent rumors which may have been false and that the Prophet basically acted upon it, he was justifiable in his action because effectively, initially, the Ghassanids and the ruler, Sharhabil bin Amr al-Ghassani, executed him. He executed an emissary of the Prophet. So that was the first act of war.
So
and then there were reports about the Byzantines basically on the border. Now, think about this. He's a human being. He basically gets a notification that there's an act of war. There's an impending narrative that comes to him about an attack that may happen and that the Byzantines were there. He does what is reasonable and he goes and marches and confronts them. Because if he didn't, and if the rumor turned out to be true, then effectively it would mean the destruction of the entire Medina community.
Now, that's my entire point. You now admit that it was a rumor. Your
I
entire
didn't say it was a rumor. I said that based on historical narrative.
The Byzantines wanted to attack the Rashidun Caliphate. And that's not
Vladimir, you again basically missed the point. I said I'm playing the devil's advocate. If I'm playing the devil's advocate and going ahead with your theory about this being a rumor, then still there was an act of war that was committed by the Ghassanids when they executed the emissary of the Prophet. And then I presented to you from Ibn Sa'd in his Kitab At-Tabakat al-Kabir that in fact the Romans had indeed concentrated large forces on the Syrian border. Well, there were no countries in the conventional sense, but in what was back then Syria. And that apparently the soldiers had been given an arm, a year's supply, and the tribes of Lakham, Judham, Amila, and Ghassan had in fact joined hands with him. They had sent their vanguards to Al-Balqa. Now, this is a report from an earlier narrative by Ibn Sa'd. It's in his book. You have the discussion in Sahih Muslim. You have the discussion also by Imam Ahmad ibn Yahya al-Baladuri that the Prophet learned that the Romans, the Amila, the Lakam, the Judham, and others had assembled against him. And so based on that and based on the reports given, he was effectively, that's a fact. That's a fact in history. There's no one that basically challenges that fact. And I'm basically surprised that you're coming with a...
Wait, you're saying that there is no one that challenges the
that
fact.
is not the vast majority, let me tell you this, the vast majority of scholars, non-Muslim scholars, accept this as a fact. There's no debate on this point. There may be a few revisionists that may challenge this, but the vast majority accept this basically as a historical fact that this in fact did happen. The emissary of the Prophet was executed, and the Romans had basically made a ready mark to go and confront and possibly invade Arabia. So that's basically what's recorded. Now, if you want to challenge the history, well, you have the right to challenge that.
Yusuf, I don't know of a single historian that would actually say that the Romans assembled an army after their war with the Sassanids, after the heavy incursions they had from the Slavs up north, to actually attack the Rashidun Caliphate. So this is what I'm talking about. The thing is, you were arguing that at Tabuk, Muhammad was responding to an impending attack by the Byzantine army. The Muslim sources say that the Byzantine army was assembled along with their Ghassanids, the vassals, and that they wanted to march on the Rashidun Caliphate. The thing is, Muhammad came there, waited for 10 days, scouted the entire area. There was no army, there was no attack. The thing is, it was a rumor, and your entire point that the Byzantines wanted to attack is absolutely
where do you get the idea that it was rumor? It was a false rumor. Where do you get the idea that that never happened? Can you give me this? Because I've given you Reverend
Yes, from Islam at War. So here we have several sources quoted from George Nafziger and Mark Walton, who are historians on this topic. It's from their book Islam at War, a history.
I've never heard of them. And I don't think they're historians. I think they're probably people of the caliber of Mark Gabriel and so on. And I mean, I'm not going to take them. Show me a historian of note that basically says that there was no Byzantine Empire or Romans that had basically marched at the borders of Syria. Give me a legitimate historian. I'm talking about William Montgomery Watt, William Meir, John Wansborough. Even if you can find me Michael Cook or Patricia Crone, if you can find anything in their works that basically challenge the idea that the Byzantines did not go and march to Syria, presented them. I'm not interested in secondary sources material from vague authors.
The area for 10 days and found no traces of any Ghassanids
but that doesn't mean that they were not there. That's a point. That doesn't mean that he arrived at the scene. That's one of the reasons he went back. But the fact that he arrived there and there were no Byzantines, it doesn't mean at all that they were not present in the first place. They would have left with the impending Muslim army that was basically developing at that particular point in time. But I mean, to suggest now that that is a rumor, you need to give me some sound historical analysis of that. I've given you the earliest. Ibn Asad is one of the earliest. Can you give me anything earlier than that that challenges and shows this is a rumor?
I gave you two very respectable historians.
Yeah, you gave me individuals that I've never heard of. I mean, these individuals, I'm going to find out who they are. I gave you the names. I gave you the names of people who do academic studies of Islamic history.
So notice
like Fred Donner, people like Angelica Noivers.
Yusuf wants specific historians to tell him about this.
Well, what's his name? Okay, give me his name. What's his historian's name?
Okay, we have two of them. We have George Nafziger and Mark Walton, who in 2003, well, that's when it was published, wrote Islam at War, a history. It is kind of a book, an encyclopedia on the subjects of Islamic, either defensive or offensive wars. Regardless,
Mark Walton, I'm looking up. I'm doing a Google search. His name doesn't even pop up. I've got Mark Walton, a story artist on Wikipedia. Mark Walton, who works for Walt Disney Studios. I mean, these are not noted historians that I've ever heard of. I've never heard of these individuals before. If you can, I gave you the names. Show me from people like Fred Donner, Show me from people like Angelica Neuwirth. Show me from even revisionists. You know, there are two historical
That's
revisionists,
fallacious.
Patricia Crone and Michael Cook. Have they challenged this?
Yusuf, you cannot request specific names. I gave you the names of the
And
historians.
what's a source? What is a source? You've quoted me a book by Mark Walton written in 2000 suggesting that this may have been a rumor that the Prophet heard. But you never gave me the source material in terms of which they're based. If I write a book about you, Vladimir, about your life story, what's a source material that I'm relying upon? I provided
you yourself,
which showed the point that this was a legitimate report received by the Prophet based on the fact that prior to this report, the Ghassanid king basically executed his emissary when he was giving a letter to the messenger of Basra.
Yusuf,
And so
you yourself
is present me, what's your source material, not a book written in 2000, present me early historical source material which says that this is a fact, that the Byzantines never appeared in Syria, and that the report by Ibn Asad is totally false. You're not presenting that. That's what I need. If you can
Yusuf,
present that,
you yourself quoted the fact that from
I see Hamza says book is rated 1.5 stars.
You quoted, but you quoted a source which says that he came there on somebody's say. Somebody said that the Byzantine armies and the Ghassanids were marching on the caliphate, and from that rumor, what did he do?
But how do you know it was a rumor? You see, this is a point. This is a point.
So notice.
What you're saying is because he came there. But this is a conclusion. It's a false dichotomy you're presenting. He receives a report and then he goes there and the Romans are not there. Therefore, it means that the Romans were not there in the first place. How do you even come to that conclusion when there have been numerous reports that an act of war had been committed? A report came to the Prophet that the Romans had basically come at the borders of Arabia. He goes and confronts them. When he arrives there after a long and arduous journey and the Romans are no longer there, how do you come to the conclusion that they were not there in the first place? Not by some silly book by Mark Walton, which is rated 1.5 stars. I need you to present me accurate information, historically speaking, that the Byzantines did not basically march to the borders of Arabia. You haven't presented that before me.
Yusuf, according to you, the Byzantines, after the war with the Sassanids and after the Slavic incursions up north, you're telling me that they marched on the Rashidun Caliphate, went on its border with Syria, waited for Muhammad. After Muhammad came, they didn't perform any attacks, waited for Muhammad there. After Muhammad came there, they were nowhere to be seen. The entire Ghassanid force was mobilized, but the Byzantines organized all the tribes there. They came with their army, removing their armies from, substantial amounts of their troops from the borders with the Slavic clans, which were attacking them at that moment, and from the borders of the Persian Empire, which could attack them at any moment. And then they came to Arabia, only to vanish when Muhammad comes.
No, I think you're missing the point.
That's nonsense.
No, but listen to this.
If it was a
single rumor, Vladimir, if it was a single rumor by the Prophet and he acted upon that rumor itself, and then he goes and approaches the Tabuk and he sees no one there, then obviously one could question the logic of this. But effectively, Ibn Asad and Al-Waqidi report that he was informed by a large number of people, by the Nabateans, that Heraclius himself had intended to come upon him and that his advance party had already reached Balkha. And that was after storing on a year's provision for his army and drafting upon the pro-Byzantine armies, the tribes of Lacham, the tribes of Jodham, the tribes of Amla, the tribes of Ghassan, under his particular banner. Now, the fact that what the indication seems to me is that the Romans retreated because they were not willing to face this upcoming force that was developing in the Muslim. What the conclusion from
Yusuf,
wait.
That the Roman army
retreated because they never basically were able to face the powerful and developing Muslim army that was willing to confront and meet them on the borders. I mean, otherwise it would be a waste of trip.
You said that let's play the devil's advocate, right? Let's suppose that the Byzantines were at the border of Tabuk. So you said that Muhammad had to undertake a long and hard journey from Medina to Tabuk to face the Byzantines.
Yeah.
Now, back in 6th century, since we were talking about 6th century warfare, before any battle, what you would do is raid the local communities that were around the battle area. You would make an incursion into the enemy's land. Now, can you show me any Byzantine sources which would say that there was a large mobilization of Ghassanids and Byzantine armies that came into Tabuk and raided around Tabuk and then made an incursion into Arabia to face Muhammad's army? The fact is, when we're talking about,
was that not part of the Byzantine Empire?
On its
Was the area
border.
around it not part of the Byzantine Empire? So what would be the need for raiding? What you see here, what the story goes is that they wanted to ambush the Muslims, and so therefore there was going to be a surprise attack on the Muslims. And when the Muslims basically came, and they knew now that the Muslim army were coming and had acknowledged their presence on the border, that basically fled the scene. Why would they go and need to raid their own empire? The empires, the Constantinople and the surrounding areas were very close to Tabuk. Why would they go and raid their own empire? It doesn't make sense. I mean, it's nonsensical to even suggest that.
Did he just say that Constantinople was close to Tabuk?
What seems to be the case is that the Roman Empire wanted to engage in an ambush surprise attack on the Muslim community in Medina. This report came to the Prophet. Prior to this report, there was an execution of his emissary by the Ghassanid king. And that was an indication.
I'll get to the emissary. That's again absolute nonsense. I'll get to the emissary. The point is, we don't have any Byzantine sources of this happening. We know.
Yeah, we've got Muslim sources. We've got Muslim. Why do you? Okay, you say we've got Byzantine sources. I haven't studied it from the perspective whether they're Byzantine. They may be or they may not be. I'm not so sure. But why are you discounting the Muslim sources? Because they are Muslim sources, and effectively they may be biased. Therefore, you are rejecting them. What kind of scholarship is that?
Yusuf, the point is, if you have a large mobilization of armies, somebody mentions it. If you have a large organized global from borders to attack a specific country within a...
But it wasn't an ordinary attack. This was going to be an ambush. They were going to take the Muslim community by surprise. And so they had not anticipated that news would basically be coming to the Prophet, that he was anticipating the attack. And in anticipation of the attack, he was going to march and confront them. That's why they retreated, because they could not continue with the ambush attack. Therefore, the point of them being present at Tabuk when the Prophet marched was a self-defeating purpose. That's the whole argument. It's not a question of getting ready to now fight in a legitimate form. They knew that this army was developing. They knew that the Muslims were now a potential challenge to them. And so they knew what they could do to confront them. They would basically launch a surprise attack on them. But this was anticipated by the Prophet. He confronted them, and in anticipation of the fact that now there was going to be an impending war, the Roman or the Byzantines left the scene. That's basically what happened. Now, if you can show me anything in any historical document which challenges that, I'm willing to look at it. Not a book which has 1 out of 2 stars or 1 out of 5 stars. I'm looking for something sound.
Yusuf, notice.
I gave you something in the absence of course. In the absence of historical material, you have to accept my version.
Let's go on your theory that the Byzantines had to retreat. So let's look at an actual map of the Byzantine Empire at that time, then look where Medina and Muhammad's forces were and see who would get to ambush Muslim communities and who would get to those communities that could potentially be ambushed first. So if we look at the map, we see
the Byzantines. They would be coming from north. I mean, how silly is that? Is a question.
Notice,
Byzantines were coming from the north. The Muslims were in the south. It stands to reason that if anybody were to get ambushed, the Muslims would be sitting ducks in Medina.
Would you actually try to listen to me?
Massacre them entirely.
We actually try to listen to me for once. The Byzantines controlled the entire area of Sinai, Israel, Jordan, Syria, and parts of Iraq, okay, at that time. Yeah. So what do we have? If they were actually amassing at the borders, according to Muslim sources, then we have them a few hundred kilometers away from Tabuk. When you look at the distance between Tabuk and Mecca, we would see that the Muslim armies would have to pass a much harsher and longer road to get to Tabuk. So what do we see? Except just totally disregarding the lack of Byzantine sources or or any other local sources, Nabatean, Ghassanid, regardless. What do we see? We see that the Byzantines could just easily perform an attack on Tabuk, raid everything on the northern border of the Rashidun Caliphate before the Muslims would even arrive there, let alone catch them in a place where they could wage a battle with them. Again,
wait, hold on a second. What Rashidun Caliphate are you talking about? There was no Khulafa Rashidin at that time. What are you talking about? What Rashidun Caliphate are you talking about?
That's how it was named later.
No, that's nonsensical. Again, I don't know where you get your... The Khulafa Rashidin was basically after the demise of the Prophet, and it's a four rightly guided.
If you want to call it Muhammad's Caliphate, it's fine.
There was no Rashidun Caliphate at that time.
That's how we call it in historical sources. We call it Rashidun Caliphate. If you want to call it Muhammad's Caliphate, even
no. But this is now you see you jumping. Vladimir, listen to me. You're jumping from one end to the. Now that I've shown your flow, there is no such thing as a Rashidun Caliphate. The fact that you mentioned that shows that your information on this particular story is morally, historically bankrupt. There was no Rashidun Caliphate at that time. In fact, the Muslims had not even were not even the overlords of that particular area at that particular point in time. It was only subsequent in Islamic history. What the point is that it took them 20 days to march. Now, in 20 days, the Romans would have obviously got information that there was a Muslim army coming, having anticipated the ambush, and basically confronted them. You're talking about a Rashidun Caliphate. There was no Rashidun Caliphate. I don't know where you're getting your sources from. The Rashidun Caliphate developed much later after the demise of the Prophet. So the fact that you're basically speaking about Rashidun Caliphate shows that you have very limited knowledge on Islamic history. And I'd urge you to start reading proper books. Don't get this
the same way we call the Byzantine Empire, the Roman Empire, even though the Roman Empire had its demise after the Germanic tribes attacked.
It's called the East Roman Empire.
I'm calling it Rashidun Caliphate.
There's no myth
that's how it was called for the most of its history. Notice
it was called the East Roman Empire, but the Rashidun Caliphate is something which was non-existent. There was no concept called the Rashidun Caliphate. I mean, that in itself exposes yourself, Vladimir. You've exposed yourself because you're speaking about the existence of a Rashidun Caliphate when the Rashidun Caliphate was non-existent. The Khalifa, the Khulafa Rashidin, that's the actual point, developed much later. I mean, that's a you've just simply, you've blown your can open. That's all I can say.
Yusuf, let's Yusuf. So, you said that it would take 20 days for
It did take 20 days. 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 That's a historical record. It did take 20 days.
So it's 20 days, right. So from Medina to Tabuk, it takes 20 days to march. Now, we see that the Byzantine border was even south of today's Jordan. It was very close to Tabuk. That's in the first place why he went to Tabuk, because he could look at the border from there. So the thing is, the Byzantine army that, according to Muslim sources, was well organized. They mobilized everybody. They had supply lines for a year, I think you said. So they could easily raid Tabuk and retreat back into Byzantine territory. Why didn't they do that?
Because you don't know where Tabuk is. Tabuk is a place between Wadi al-Qura in the Hijaz and part of Syria. So it was already part and parcel of that. It was that's where it is. That historically, according to the Ghazwat, the campaign, that's where basically it is. So it would be it would be part and parcel of, in a sense, the Roman Empire. Their aim was not to raid the surrounding. You see, you're failing to understand repeatedly that this was not a conventional meeting of armies getting ready for battle. This was basically an ambush that was going to occur. So if they were going to raid the communities surrounding them, if they were.
No, first of all, Yusuf, if
they would listen to the point. If they were going to raid the communities, that would have immediately, from their perspective, alerted the impending Muslim army that there was basically an army gathering and waiting to come for them, because knowledge would have spread. And so their whole aim in basically ambushing was to do this in a clandestine fashion. And so if you are saying, why did they not raid? Well, it would be because of the fact that if they raid, this knowledge would have come and they wanted to take the Muslims by surprise. But already his emissary was executed. Already the Nabateans had basically come and given him message of this impending attack. So therefore, they were already aware of the fact that this army
So
was
wait,
getting
Yusuf,
to
they
attack.
want to ambush Muhammad's army, and
Well,
then
not ambush Muhammad's army. They were going to come and destroy and wreak havoc on the Medina community.
oh, great.
They were going to destroy the entire. The main aim was that the Muslims were rising as a force. If you look at them at that time, they had about close to, I think the reports say, 10,000 horses, 30,000 fighting men. They were.
Dude,
They were.
those weren't the entire Byzantine army had 50,000 members at that time. They were
Well, I'm saying that the Muslim army had 30,000 warriors
okay.
and 10,000 horses. Give me your facts. Where do you get the facts about the Byzantine having 50,000? Can you give me a source? Can you give me a source where it says that the Byzantines had 50,000 soldiers waiting? Give me a source. I gave you a source. It's from the Ghazwat al-Usra. It's from the book of Waqidi. It's from Sahih Muslim. Where do you get the source about 50,000 Roman army soldiers waiting? Give me the source.
So in
you simply waste most of the comments that you wasted time. You hyperventilating. You are thumb sucking. You don't know historical facts. You're getting confused with the Khulafa Rashidin, and now you're bringing up red herrings to try and indicate that there was no Byzantines that appeared. I mean, history defeats you completely, because there is no historian of note that challenges this, that the Byzantines, in fact, there's no one. You cannot give me a single historian. Quoting obscure sources doesn't make your case any stronger. If you can give me a standard, a proper source, I may consider it, and then of course look at it. But so far you've given me nothing. In fact, you showed that you've confused history. You've confused the timelines in history. You've confused the Khulafa Rashidin and the time of the Prophet. Totally confused timelines. That's the point, Vladimir. And I think you need to go back. It's important that you need to go back and do a proper historical assessment. Reading from the internet, reading from the Answering Islam website is not going to basically assist you in any way.
Okay, so
go back and do some study and religious significant source on this particular point.
Okay, so now let's address what you're saying if you're done. So where are my sources that support that the Byzantine army, had around 50,000 members at that time? Well, we have several historians stating that: Haldon, Peters, Kagi, and for example, we have Walter Emil Kagi.
Again, you're going back to the book Walter Emil. I'm not talking about. Give me an early historical source. Not to quote a certain book. Give me a historical source and back it up with information from the 9th, 10th century. Either oral tradition or sources that exist there. Not some book written in the 20th century.
Will you allow me to speak?
Based on speculation.
According to Walter Emil Kagi, a professor of Byzantine history at the University of Chicago, the entire size of the Byzantine army during the 7th century might have totaled 100,000, but possibly even half this number.
So if it's half that number, how could the entire force, if it was half the number, how could then, and if half the number would be 50,000, are you saying that the Byzantines left Constantinople totally unprotected and marched with the entire army of 50,000 and marched at Tabuk? Is that what you're saying? Because that's the assumption.
Absolutely not. What I am saying is that the Muslims, the Byzantines had to defend from the invading Slavs and invading Slavic countries from the north, and a potential threat from the Persians at the east. And you're telling me that they assembled an army that could, and no, Tabuk wasn't a part of their empire at that time, but regardless, that they assembled an army, mobilized and paid for them, mobilized the Ghassanid, which were their vassals, organized the supply lines in order to ambush and attack Medinan communities.
What I'm saying, and what the history seems to be, can I come? Because you've been going on for some time, Vladimir. What I'm saying is that the army of the Romans at Tabuk, in all possibility, were far less than those of the Muslims. You say that the army was 50,000. Well, and then you said that
I didn't say they were 50,000. That's nonsense. I was saying that the entire army in the 7th century was 50,000.
We've been going on with speculation. Give me a historical source document or a notable historian who basically states.
I did.
But you haven't. You've cited a book which I've never heard of. You've cited people I've never heard of, never came across. They're probably
No, a professor of Byzantine history at the University of Chicago is a notable
the book you quoted
historian.
was Islam at War. Was that not correct? Islam at War. So Islam at War. So it's not an objective historical book. It's a book which wants to probably.
So notice, are you
Islam at War? Is that the book? Is that the name of the book? Islam at War. That's
yes, yes. So now going to what we were talking about, Walter Milkagi, who is one of the foremost historians on Byzantine history alive in the world today, a professor at University of Chicago. Are you trying to discredit him?
Well, what I'm saying is that according to what you're presenting, you said that the Byzantine army were about close to 100,000 or less, or even half of that. Now, if that is the case, it would not make sense for all the Byzantine, because you said 50,000.
Of course it wouldn't. Of course it wouldn't.
But that's what you said. You see, again, you're contradicting yourself, Vladimir, because you said earlier
we have this
50,000 marched to Tabuk. I'm saying that the figure was far lesser than the Muslim army that were at Tabuk, because the Muslims came with 30,000 men. They came with 10,000 horses. And so with this army of Muslims coming, the Byzantines retreated because they now knew that the ambush would fail. They weren't getting ready, engaging in guerrilla warfare. They were basically engaging in what we would call ambush warfare. And so the ambush warfare failed.
Where was the ambush going to take place? What was the aim of the ambush of the Byzantines?
Well, very, very simple. Very simple. The aim of the ambush was to find the Muslim community at the most vulnerable. That would be in Medina, where the women and the children were. To find them at the most vulnerable, and in doing so, when they advance at the Muslim community, they would basically go and destroy this rising Muslim force that would be viewed as an impending threat. That's the whole rationale behind that.
You're proposing.
I'm saying this.
The Byzantines.
Everybody says this.
You're
more
proposing.
More conquest that was going to happen, because they had now lost the West Roman Empire. They were losing it. The Gothic invasion and the Gallic invasion had destroyed them. So it would be
they long lost it with the.
Well, but Jihad was an opportunity. You see, if they basically destroyed the army, of Muslims, which were becoming a rising force. This was at Tabuk. They were now the overlords of Arabia. If they destroyed this and they subjugated and enslaved the Muslims, they would effectively be conquerors of Saudi Arabia. of Arabia itself, of the entire Arabia. If they moved south, they would expand the empire. But you're failing to see the fact. I mean, each time I'm refuting your arguments, you're coming up with something new. But you're not coming up with a substance. And I'm thinking you're just going around in circles, Vladimir, and even confusing history.
Wait, Yusuf, so what you're proposing
history entirely, that's the point.
Please let me speak. What you're proposing, Yusuf, is that with the attacks from the Slavs and with the Persian Empire at their doors, the Byzantines organized an army that is, in your words, that was much lesser than the Muslim army, so less than 30,000 men, much less than that, certainly much less than that, because they had to defend themselves, and that they wanted to strike at the heart of the caliphate. Right into Medina.
There was no Caliphate. What are you talking about? You see, you keep on talking about the Caliphate. There was no Caliphate in existence. So how can they strike?
Well, Khalif is a ruler. Muhammad was a ruler at that time. Regardless,
the whole concept of the Khalif is developed later on in Islamic history. Listen to this, Vladimir.
Yusuf, wait, please address the point. Yusuf, wait, please address the point.
There was no Khalif. You keep on talking about the Caliphate. There was no Caliphate in existence. The effect of the invasion was that the Muslim influence and the domination of the Arabian Peninsula.
So what you want to do, Yusuf, is tell me that the Byzantine Empire, which was under attack, wanted to attack the heart of the empire, of the caliphate. Yes, I call it the caliphate because Khalif is a leader. Muhammad was a leader at that time, regardless. They wanted to attack the heart of this caliphate, and with a force that is much, much lesser than the force of the Muslims. They wanted to get into the heart of the caliphate, and what then? Get cut off and destroyed? That's utter nonsense. I'm sorry.
You see, again, you're failing to note the point. If it was an ambush, even if you've got the most mightiest armies, when the Red Indians...
How do you ambush a city?
Listen. If they ambushed the Muslims who had not prepared for war and were not ready to face them, even with the most powerful army, in ambush, you would be totally destroyed. Here's the point.
Dude, if they want to attack
Vladimir,
Medina,
Islam's
Medina is
dominion
the heart
was
of this
becoming
caliphate.
apparent in the Arabian region.
If
They
you
knew
have
this fact.
thousands of Byzantines marching, somebody would inform Medinans, and then they would form a defense. The entire
Well,
premise
but that's the point. But the point is that that would be the nerve center. But you see, that's a problem. That would be the nerve center. If people come to your nerve center and attack you in your home and want to rape you and rape your wives and children and so on, despite the fact that you basically are armed, that will still be the nerve center. That will be the tender point, because there would be an enormous amount of destruction being perpetrated. So therefore, the Muslim army moved out of Arabia and confronted them in Tabuk. That's the whole point.
Are you trying to imply that the Byzantines wanted to march through the entirety of the
point, Vladimir,
not get attacked, and actually attack at Medina?
Vladimir, we can have a debate on this particular point at length. I think there's a lot of speakers, and it's 1 o'clock here in South Africa. What I can say in conclusion is that Islam was a rising force. The Byzantines recognized this. They wanted to take them by ambush. When the Muslims anticipated the Byzantines attacking them, then they basically approached them in Tabuk, and then, of course, the army fled the scene. That's a historical narrative. You can't break it down with any kind of revisionist material.
There are more speakers,
so I think basically, effectively, what you've raised is a whole lot of not just red herrings, but total falsehood. I mean, there's no such a thing as a Caliphate or Khulafa or Rashidin even existing in the time. The concept of the Khalif and the concept of the Prophet Muhammad, they were two different leaders. It's two different concepts entirely. How you can use them, I don't know. But I mean, thank you for engaging, Vladimir.
Okay, so Yusuf,
thank you
on this topic, wait.
Well, Vladimir, I mean, you had more than I've entertained you for more than half an hour. I think you're making things up as you're going along. You're fabricating information, and I don't think I should deal with you more. The other speakers, I mean, you've had the longest time. I've never had this much of time with any speaker when Jonathan had his programs, and I think I've refuted all the allegations you've made, and I think that there's nothing more I can say. You can have your views. If they're false, if they're incorrect, well, that's your business. But thank you again, Vladimir, and I look forward to maybe chatting you on a personal level sometime in the future.
Okay, let's just take one last text submitted question, then we'll.
Okay, that's fine, because it's close to 1:15. I think I'm disturbing the whole household here.
Okay, sorry. Okay, this is the last question. This is from Hatun. She says, you said all prophets are peaceful and Quran is peaceful too. Please unpack what happened below people, as it seems that Quran and Muhammad strongly disagrees with you. And then she lists a number of people, 16, who were put to death by Muhammad. And she says, also kindly give some names of the caliphs from 1st century who were not killed and also not practiced violence.
So sorry, I didn't get the last issue, Jonathan.
She says, kindly give some names of the caliphs from 1st century who were not killed and also not practice violence. If you hit the Q&A button, you can read the question yourself as well.
Well, I'm just let me go to the Q&A. I see the question is about the number of caliphs who were not killed. Well, I mean, there's a list. Abu Bakr was not killed, but I mean, the caliphs Umar, Uthman, Ali, these were all people who were assassinated, and these were effectively good people, and you had insurgencies against them, and effectively you had people rising up and committing violence against them. It's not the caliphs. When we talk about the rightly guided caliphs, we are basically talking about in the early part of Islam, these people who wanted to implement the teachings of the Qur'an to its fullest, implementing justice and law. And out of all the 4 caliphs, 3 of them were in fact killed. They were murdered. They were murdered very brutally. Umar was murdered. Ali was in fact assassinated. And in fact, the people who engaged in the assassination of these individuals were extremists in the Muslim community, the Khawarij or the Kharijites. When we talk about Islamic extremism in the world today, we do have a historical precedent for that. And the historical precedent is not Islam itself, but the historical precedent is extremist factions that have arisen in time in Islamic history. You look at the Hashishain and the Assassins and the Khawarij and so on and so forth. That is part of of what happened in Islamic history, and the Quran obviously speaks out against that, and it's speaking about people who, again, atomized scripture, took an absolutist position of black and white, engaged in takfir, basically stated that certain people were not Muslims, and on that basis suggested that they needed to be killed, and these people engaged in lots of acts of violence. So I haven't studied too much about the later part of the Caliphs, but all I can tell you in the Khulafa Rashidin, which Vladimir was confusing with the time of the expedition of Tabuk, the first three Caliphs, the last three Caliphs were in fact executed and in fact killed.
Okay, and what would you say about the individuals that she lists who were put to death by Muhammad, including, you know, the poets Asma bint Marwan and so on?
Yeah. Again, I mean, the story of Asma bin Marwan, that's quite interesting that she raises that particular point. The story of Asma bin Marwan is not, in fact, mentioned in any hadith literature. In fact, if you look at Sahih Bukhari, volume 8, book number 82, hadith number 836, Aisha, for example, stated that Allah's messenger never took revenge for his own self in any matter presented to him till Allah's limit were exceeded. Sunan Abi Dawud, if you look at book 42, hadith number 4767, the messenger of God never took revenge on his own behalf. Now, you do basically have a report which is basically concerning an alleged assassination. And that basic report was contained, I think, if I'm not mistaken, in one of the historical, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Ibn Ishaq. But the story of the murder has been challenged on a number of bases, because the individuals who relate this particular narrative basically make a number of critical and key mistakes. Ibn Hisham, for example, who is the forerunner, the actual, the one who, the recension of Ibn Ishaq, he relates the fact that Asma bin Marwan was killed by someone called Umair. And this man, Umair, was someone who was blind. He was blind. And a blind man, we are given to understand, goes out of his way and he commits murder in a stranger's house during nocturnal quietness in the middle of the night. And so what you have is that a number of, and this is not now modern day apologists who are trying to basically question and challenge this, but a lot of individuals, a lot of classical mufassirin, commentators and historians in the early Islamic period have basically challenged this and questioned this on the basis that the entire story does not in fact make any sense. If the Prophet wanted to assassinate Asma bin Marwan, why would he go and send someone who was totally blind to go and assassinate this particular woman? And how does this woman go and look up for this lady? And how does a man go and look for the woman in the night, in the middle of the night? There were no electricity, no lights, nothing. And this lady doesn't even see him. So there's a blind man. Is it the blind killing the blind? Well, what do we have? And so what basically happens is that a lot of scholars have effectively challenged and condemned this. And not surprisingly, you know, if you look at the hadith literature, there's a lot of problematic material. I don't deny that in hadith material, but the story and this narrative is not contained in any of the hadith material. In fact, it's quite clear in the hadith that I've basically quoted, even in Riyadh al-Salihin, book number 1, hadith number 641, that Aisha reported, whenever the Prophet was given a choice between two matters, he'd always choose the easier as long as it was not sinful to do so. But if it was sinful, he was most strict in avoiding it. And then she goes on to say that he never took revenge upon anybody for his own sake. But when God's bindings were outraged, then of course the penalty of God would be invoked. But the problem is that if we are to believe some pseudo-biographers coming hundreds and 200 years of later, narrating that Jonathan killed someone or I killed someone, what do we make of this particular story, particularly when the narrative of the story doesn't make sense? The narrative goes on to say that it's a blind man in Medina, goes in the middle of the night, goes and finds his house, enters a house, and as a blind man goes and stabs this woman. It just doesn't make sense. And that's so these people who quote the story of Asma bin Marwan need to go back to Ibn Ishaq and read it entirely. And when you read it entirely, you will find that it absolutely does not make sense. So who do we believe? Do we believe the Prophet's wife, who stated that he never took revenge? Or do we believe some biographers coming hundreds of years later reporting a pseudo story on the Prophet? One thing also we need to note, and just want to conclude on that point, Jonathan, is that when you look at volumes like, the Tarikh of Al-Tabari or the Tafsir al-Tabari, Tabari, for example, Ibn Ishaq, these were not historians in the classic sense. In other words, as we would find people like, some of the historians we see today in the world that would make a critical analysis of the story. They were more chroniclers. So they would chronicle a whole series of narratives that were basically, be in existence. And so they would just simply compile it and put it together, and through means of oral tradition. This was primarily how stories of the Prophet developed, through means of oral tradition. And so these stories are viewed with significant caution and also are challenged. And I might also add this one last point, that if a Christian wants to approach Islam academically, because he's not a Muslim, he's not a believing Muslim, then and he wants to adopt the method of academics, then he needs to follow the means and methodology of academics. Academics like Haron Motsky, for example, and others have challenged the veracity of these particular narratives and reports. Some even go to the existence of challenging the existence of the Prophet. That's a bit far-fetched. But the point is that there were a lot of stories that were existence. And I would argue that many people would invent and mythologize the life of the Prophet in order to justify the expansionist nature of their own particular rulings and where they wanted to justify violence. So if you want to justify violence and you don't find any violence in the Quran, well, what do you do then? You go and mythologize and invent and fabricate a story and then attribute it to the Prophet. And then, well, you say, oh, I see, the Prophet did this, so well, I can do this. So the Prophet said you can kill an apostate. Well, that means an apostate can be killed. It's a pity nobody asked me more about the issue of apostasy, but I would like to have expanded it in terms of how it became incorporated into Islamic history. But maybe that's a discussion for another time.
Well, thank you, Yusuf. It's been good to have you on again.